It was the morning of December 26, 1996, in Boulder, Colorado. The sun had not yet risen over the snow-dusted foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Along the quiet, tree-lined streets of the city's most affluent neighborhoods, the lingering magic of Christmas still hung in the air. Wreaths adorned heavy oak doors, strings of colored lights blinked lazily beneath a blanket of fresh powder, and the last of the holiday's indulgent calm wrapped every manicured lawn in silence. On 15th Street, inside a sprawling, red-brick Tudor mansion, a nightmare was about to be born, one that would shatter that silence forever, consume the American public, and ignite a mystery that, decades later, remains as dark and impenetrable as the frozen Boulder earth. The house belonged to John and Patsy Ramsey, a couple who seemed to have stepped directly out of the pages of a glossy lifestyle magazine. John Ramsey was a self-made millionaire, a former Navy officer and pilot who had founded a successful computer services company. Patsy was a former Miss West Virginia, a woman of striking poise and beauty, whose charm and social grace had made her a fixture in Boulder's elite circles. Together with their two children, 6-year-old JonBenét and 9-year-old Burke, they represented the very picture of American prosperity and happiness. Their home, a 15-room Tudor estate that sprawled across nearly 7,000 square feet, was filled with antiques, expensive art, and the warmth of a family that had everything. But by the time the sun would set on that bitter December day, that image would be twisted into a grotesque funhouse mirror reflection. A riddle wrapped in tragedy and suspicion that no one could ever truly solve. The Christmas of 1996 had been, by all outward appearances, a perfect family celebration. The Ramseys had hosted a holiday party at their home on the 23rd of December, a glittering affair attended by friends, neighbors, and business associates. Children raced through the corridors playing hide-and-seek, while adults sipped champagne and admired the lavishly decorated tree that stood in the living room, its boughs drooping with ornaments collected from travels around the world. 2 days later, on Christmas Day, the family had spent a quiet morning unwrapping presents at home, before heading to a dinner party at the home of family friends, the Whites. Photos taken that evening show JonBenét, a tiny beauty queen with blonde hair and luminous eyes, dressed in a festive red turtleneck and black velvet vest, her smile as bright as the camera flash. She was the center of attention, a child whose pageant girl poise and natural charisma enchanted everyone she met. No one could have known that those photographs would become the last images of her alive, frozen in time as a permanent reminder of all that was about to be lost. The Ramsey family returned home around 9 o'clock that night. According to their later accounts, John Ramsey carried a sleeping JonBenét from the car, her small body limp with exhaustion from a day of excitement. Patsy helped Burke into his pajamas, and the house soon settled into a deep winter stillness. The children were tucked into their beds on the second floor, in bedrooms that faced each other across a long hallway. JonBenét's room was a confection of pink and white, a princess fantasy filled with dolls, ribbons, and the elaborate crowns she had won at pageants across the South. Just outside her door, a spiral staircase wound down to the ground floor, where the family's living areas, kitchen, and John Ramsey's study sprawled across a warren of interconnected rooms. It was a big house, a labyrinth of doors and passages, the kind of place where a child could get lost in a game of make-believe. But what happened there that night was not a game, and it was not make-believe. The first crack in the facade came just before 6 the next morning. The sky outside was still an inky black, the neighborhood shrouded in pre-dawn cold. Patsy Ramsey would later testify that she rose early to prepare for a family trip to their vacation home in Charlevoix, Michigan. She descended the back staircase, a spiral staircase that led from the second floor to the ground floor hallway near the kitchen, and that was when she saw it. 3 pieces of paper, lined notebook paper of a sort that could be found in any home, lying on the bottom steps. At first, she thought it was something Burke had left there, perhaps a note for Santa. She bent down, still in her pajamas, and began to read. The words that met her eyes were not a child's scrawl. They were formed in neat, sharp letters, written with a black felt-tip pen. The message was bizarre, chilling, and utterly unthinkable. Listen carefully, the note began. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We do respect your business, but not the country that it serves. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession. She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her to see 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter." The note went on, a rambling, almost theatrical screed that spanned 2.5 pages. It demanded $118,000 in cash, a sum bizarrely specific, and warned that the family was under constant surveillance. The note promised that a call would come between 8 and 10 that morning with further instructions. It ended with the words, "Victory." SBTC, the signature, those 4 ominous letters, would become one of the enduring enigmas of the case. Patsy Ramsey's reaction, as she would later describe it, was a mixture of disbelief and primal terror. She screamed for her husband. John Ramsey, still upstairs, came running. Together they rushed to JonBenét's room, their hearts pounding. The bed was empty. The covers were pulled back, but the small form that should have been sleeping there was gone. On her pillow lay a small scrap of red satin, the dress she had worn to the Christmas party the night before, carefully laid out as if for a photograph. The room was otherwise tidy, nothing out of place. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no mud tracked across the pristine carpet. Just the absence of a 6-year-old girl where she should have been, and the presence of a ransom note that defied everything they knew about kidnapping and crime. John Ramsey told Patsy to call 911 immediately. The call was logged at 5:52 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. The tape of that call, later released to the public, remains one of the most analyzed and argued over pieces of audio in criminal history. Patsy Ramsey's voice is frantic, gasping, barely coherent. "We have a kidnapping, there's a note left, our daughter's gone," she sobs to the dispatcher. "There's a ransom note here. It says they have our daughter. It says she's safe and unharmed. It says we're not to contact anybody. They'll kill her if we do." The dispatcher, a woman named Kimberly Archuleta, tried to calm her, asked her if she had touched the note, how many people were in the house. In the background, barely audible, John Ramsey can be heard speaking, though his words are indistinct. Later, some investigators would claim to hear a voice, possibly Burke's, asking, "What did you find?" Patsy's anguished reply, help me Jesus," would become a haunting refrain. Within minutes, Officer Rick French of the Boulder Police Department was the first to arrive at the Ramsey home. He was a patrol officer with a calm demeanor, and he found a scene of controlled chaos. John Ramsey was pacing, dressed in a sweater and slacks. Patsy sat on a sofa, wrapped in a coat, her face a mask of terror. Friends of the family had already started to arrive, summoned by panicked phone calls. The house, which should have been sealed as a pristine crime scene, quickly began to fill with people, family, friends, a minister, a victim advocate. No one thought to cordon off the area. No one checked the entire house thoroughly. The ransom note, the single most critical piece of evidence, was left lying on the hallway floor where it had been found, handled by multiple people before police even thought to secure it. Officer French conducted a cursory walkthrough of the house. He checked the open doors and windows, looking for any sign of forced entry. He found none. The ground floor was a maze of rooms: a butler's pantry, a study, a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, a sprawling basement area. French made a brief inspection of the basement, opening a door to a train room, a storage area, and a small, windowless room where the water heater and boiler were housed. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. On the main floor, he noticed a broken window in a small, cluttered room near the kitchen, a space used as a playroom for the children. Glass shards lay on the floor inside, and a suitcase was positioned beneath the sill. John Ramsey explained that he had broken the window himself months earlier when he had locked himself out. It was an anecdote that, in the moment, seemed plausible enough. No one thought to look more closely. No one peered deeper into the basement's shadows. The focus remained on the ransom note, on waiting for the phone call from the supposed kidnappers, on negotiating for the safe return of a child. A team of FBI agents was contacted and began advising the Boulder police by phone. The FBI noted immediately that the ransom note was unlike any they had ever seen. It was too long, the longest ransom note in the Bureau's recorded history. Kidnappers do not linger to write 3-page manifestos. They do not specify a demand for $118,000, a figure that exactly matched a bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. A detail few outside the immediate family were likely to know. They do not quote movie dialogue. Lines in the note, such as "don't try to grow a brain," would later be identified as echoing lines from the film Speed and other action movies. The note was written on paper from a pad that belonged to the Ramseys, and the pen used to write it was later found in a cup near the kitchen phone. The handwriting was studied, analyzed by experts, and would become the subject of fierce debate. Some analysts would say it showed characteristics consistent with Patsy Ramsey's own handwriting, while others would argue that the similarities were inconclusive or even deliberately disguised. The note itself was a dark masterpiece of misdirection, unless, of course, it was something else entirely. Detective Linda Arndt, the lead investigator for Boulder PD, arrived on the scene at approximately 8 o'clock that morning. She was a seasoned officer, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the peculiar, oppressive atmosphere of the Ramsey house. The ransom call never came. 10 o'clock passed and the phone stayed silent. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Patsy Ramsey sat clutching a Bible, her eyes red from crying. John Ramsey paced, periodically checking with police and FBI agents, his demeanor shifting between controlled calm and visible agony. Family friends milled about, making coffee, offering prayers, inadvertently trampling on evidence that would never be recovered. The window of opportunity to find JonBenét alive, if there ever had been one, was closing with each passing minute. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Detective Arndt made a decision that would haunt the investigation forever. She asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to conduct a thorough search of the entire house from top to bottom, to see if anything was missing or out of place that might provide a clue. She wanted them to start in the basement. The instruction was well-intentioned. She needed more eyes on the property, and she herself was occupied managing the scene. But it placed a potential suspect, if John Ramsey was to be considered one, in a position to contaminate what might be the most critical part of the crime scene. What happened next would twist the knife of tragedy even deeper into the heart of the case. John Ramsey and Fleet White descended the stairs into the basement. The basement was a half-finished space, a labyrinth of rooms used for storage, utilities, and the family's hobbies. There was a wine cellar, a train room filled with John Ramsey's elaborate model railroad set, a laundry area, and a boiler room. The two men moved through the dim, cold rooms, flashlights sweeping across stacks of boxes and disused furniture. According to John Ramsey's later accounts, he felt an urge to check the small, windowless room that Officer French had glanced at hours earlier, the room that held the boiler and water heater. The door to that room was slightly ajar, and it gave onto a cramped space with a concrete floor and exposed pipes. As Ramsey pushed the door open, the beam of his flashlight fell upon a form lying on the floor. It was JonBenét. She was lying on her back, covered by a white blanket that had been taken from her bed. A piece of black duct tape covered her mouth. Her wrists were bound together with a length of white cord, and a matching cord was knotted loosely around her neck. Attached to a wooden stick, a paintbrush handle that had been snapped from one of Patsy's art supplies. The child was dressed in a white long-sleeved shirt with a silver star on the front and white underwear. She was not moving. John Ramsey let out a cry that Fleet White later described as the sound of a soul being torn apart. Ramsey scooped his daughter into his arms and carried her up the stairs, her body stiff with rigor mortis. He placed her on the floor of the living room, near the base of the spiral staircase, and ripped the tape from her mouth. The blanket, the cord, the state of her body, all of it told a story of something far more sinister than a kidnapping gone wrong. Detective Arndt, alone in the house with multiple people, was confronted with a scene of utter chaos. John Ramsey had destroyed the integrity of the crime scene by moving the body. He had removed the tape, loosened the bindings, and covered the child with a blanket upstairs. The basement room, which should have been photographed, swabbed, and examined with the most meticulous care, was now compromised beyond repair. Arndt would later be criticized for not taking control, for not securing the house, for not separating and questioning the family immediately. But in that moment, confronted with the body of a murdered child in a house full of distraught people, she did the only thing she could. She called for backup and tried to contain the unraveling scene. The subsequent examination of JonBenét's body would reveal the gruesome details that the public would soon devour in a frenzy of speculation. She had suffered a massive skull fracture, an impact so severe that it had split her skull from front to back, causing bleeding in the brain. There was no external injury to the scalp, The damage was all internal, consistent with a blow from a blunt object, perhaps a flashlight or a baseball bat. In addition to the head trauma, a garrote, a device formed from the broken paintbrush handle and the nylon cord, had been tightened around her neck with such force that it had left deep ligature furrows in the skin. The official cause of death would be listed as asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. The sequence of events was ambiguous. Had she been struck first and then strangled? Or had the garrote been the primary cause of death? The autopsy also noted signs of chronic inflammation, suggesting prior trauma, though this finding would be fiercely disputed and politicized in the years to come. Perhaps the most disturbing detail was the piece of evidence that would spawn an entire industry of conjecture: a small, almost invisible spot of blood on the crotch of her underwear. DNA testing of that spot would yield a male genetic profile that did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. It was a thread of unidentified DNA that would become the cornerstone of theories about an intruder, a stranger who had broken into the home, committed unspeakable acts, and vanished into the night. But the DNA was only a fragment, just a few cells, and its presence did not eliminate the possibility of contamination. Nor did it explain the cascade of inconsistencies that surrounded the Ramseys' own accounts. The ransom note, the broken window, the absence of forced entry, the bizarre specificity of the demand. The fact that the note was written on paper from the family's own pad, with a pen that came from their own kitchen. These pieces formed a puzzle that seemed to have no clear solution. The garrote, constructed from materials found inside the house, suggested a killer who was not only familiar with the layout but comfortable enough to take the time to fashion a complex ligature. The paintbrush handle came from Patsy's art supplies, kept in a tray in a second-floor room. The cord was never sourced to an outside purchase. The duct tape, too, was never conclusively traced. And then there was the pineapple. In the autopsy, the contents of JonBenét's stomach revealed a snack of fresh pineapple and cherries consumed shortly before her death. The Ramseys insisted they had not given her pineapple after the Christmas dinner at the Whites, yet a bowl of pineapple was found on the breakfast room table, bearing Burke's fingerprints and no one else's. It was a small, curious fact that did not align with the story of a child who had been carried to bed asleep and never woke. As the day of December 26 gave way to evening, the Ramsey family was taken to a friend's house, where they would remain for days, sequestered from the media storm that was already gathering. The Boulder police, realizing the magnitude of what they were facing, called in assistance from the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. But the early hours, the golden window of evidence preservation, had been squandered. The crime scene had been contaminated not just by John Ramsey carrying his daughter's body upstairs, but by the friends, the minister, the advocate, the officers who had walked through without protective suits or a proper log. The house had not been cordoned off until late in the afternoon. Critical trace evidence, fibers, hairs, fingerprints beyond the obvious, was lost forever. In the days that followed, the nation woke up to the image of JonBenét Ramsey. The pageant videos, the portraits of a child transformed by makeup and elaborate costumes into a miniature adult, became a feeding frenzy for tabloid television. The juxtaposition of innocence and exploitation, the child beauty queen with the dazzling smile and the provocative stage poses, ignited a moral panic and a voyeuristic obsession. Every news cycle brought fresh revelations, leaked details, and armchair detectives dissecting the Ramseys' body language, their interviews, their refusal to cooperate with police in the way investigators demanded. The Ramseys, for their part, retreated behind a wall of attorneys and public relations professionals. Within days, they had hired a high-powered legal team, a move that Boulder police interpreted as obstruction. The family would not submit to formal, separate interviews for more than 4 months. This delay, coupled with the perception that they were being shielded by wealth and privilege, set the stage for an adversarial relationship between the police and the primary victims that would cripple the investigation. John and Patsy Ramsey gave a single, carefully orchestrated interview to CNN on New Year's Day, 1997, in which they sat side by side, hand in hand, and proclaimed their innocence while pleading for the public's help in finding the monster who had killed their daughter. The interview was both a public relations masterstroke and a disaster. Many viewers found their composure suspicious, their refusal to break down under the weight of grief evidence of some hidden guilt. Others saw two people in shock, doing exactly what their lawyers had instructed them to do in a situation that no parent should ever face. The Boulder police, meanwhile, were building a theory. Detective Arndt, in a moment of candor captured on a 911 call recording, expressed her belief that John Ramsey was responsible, that the ransom note was a fake, that the entire scene was a stage set. Her suspicions would eventually be echoed by a number of investigators, though not all. The FBI's profilers called in to consult noted that the ransom note was almost certainly written by a woman, based on linguistic patterns and emotional tone. And that the staging of the body, the blanket, the tape, the loosely tied cord, suggested a killer with a close relationship to the victim, someone who wanted to cover the body with care. Perhaps even a parent. The phrase "small foreign faction" was seen as a clumsy attempt to misdirect, a fabrication born of a creative mind rather than a genuine criminal enterprise. Yet the DNA evidence persisted as a stubborn counter-narrative, a tiny genetic breadcrumb that led nowhere and everywhere. The investigation would grind on for years, through grand jury proceedings that would ultimately end without an indictment, through books, documentaries, and the relentless churn of the 24-hour news cycle. Suspects would surface and fade: a neighborhood man with a history of mental illness, a convicted sex offender who had been in Boulder at the time, a former employee of John Ramsey's company. Each lead would be pursued with a flurry of hope and discarded. The house on 15th Street would eventually be sold, the basement sealed off in memory. JonBenét would be buried in a cemetery in Marietta, Georgia, next to her half-sister from John's first marriage, who had died in a car accident years earlier. The gravestone would bear the dates of her brief life: August 6, 1990, December 26, 1996, but the story was far from over. The media frenzy would spawn a cottage industry of speculation, with theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Intruder theorists pointed to the DNA, the broken window, and a series of unsolved break-ins in the neighborhood. They painted a picture of a lone pedophile who had stalked JonBenét at her pageants, entered the house while the family was out, and lay in wait. They noted that a rope was found in the spare bedroom above the garage, that a suitcase stood beneath the broken window as if used as a step, that a neighbor had reported hearing a child scream around midnight, a scream that the Ramseys claimed they never heard, even though their bedroom was just above the basement. Proponents of the family involvement theory, on the other hand, pointed to the absurdity of the ransom note, the absence of forced entry, the familiarity with the house's layout and the family's habits, and the behavior of the parents in the hours and days following the murder. They theorized that Patsy, in a fit of rage over some childhood accident, perhaps bedwetting, had struck JonBenét, causing the head wound, and that the garrote and ransom note were part of an elaborate cover-up. The truth remained and remains elusive. The mystery of JonBenét Ramsey is not just a whodunit. It is a dark mirror reflecting the fears and obsessions of the culture that consumed her image. The case broke all the rules of crime fiction, because in fiction the clues point toward a solution. Here the clues pointed in all directions at once, canceling each other out, creating a paradox that no amount of analysis could penetrate. The first part of this saga ends here, on the morning of December 26, with a dead child in a basement, a house full of unanswered questions, and the first stirrings of a media firestorm that would soon engulf the world. The stage was set for a drama that would last a lifetime, and the first act had just drawn to a close in the most chilling fashion imaginable. The days that followed the discovery of JonBenét Ramsey's body were not a slow, somber procession toward justice. They were a maelstrom, a howling storm of media scrutiny, police missteps, and the slow, methodical construction of a wall between the Ramsey family and the outside world. The quiet Tudor mansion on 15th Street, once a symbol of Boulder's genteel affluence, had become a haunted house, its image broadcast into millions of living rooms. The press descended on the neighborhood like a cloud of locusts, satellite trucks lining the curbs, reporters stamping their feet against the cold, their breath misting in the air as they delivered breathless updates to a captive nation. The story of a murdered child beauty queen had all the ingredients of a modern American tragedy: wealth, glamour, mystery. and the sinister suggestion that the darkest evil can lurk behind the brightest of facades. Inside the house, the investigation was already spiraling into a quagmire of jurisdictional tension and mutual distrust. The Boulder Police Department, a relatively small agency unused to crimes of this magnitude, found itself overwhelmed. The initial hours had been squandered, the crime scene contaminated, and now the department's relationship with the Ramsey family was deteriorating at a catastrophic rate. The Ramseys, through their newly assembled legal team, were refusing to submit to separate formal interviews. The police saw obstruction, the family saw self-preservation. John Ramsey, a man accustomed to control and corporate strategy, had immediately reached out to his attorney, Mike Bynum, who in turn brought in a formidable array of legal and public relations talent. Within days, the family had hired former homicide detective John E. Douglas, the FBI's legendary profiler, and a cadre of private investigators. The message was clear: the Ramseys would not trust the Boulder police to solve their daughter's murder. They would mount their own defense and their own investigation. This adversarial posture created a feedback loop of suspicion. Detective Linda Arndt, the lead investigator, had already formed a damning opinion of John Ramsey. In the chaotic moments after he carried his daughter's lifeless body up from the basement, Arndt had locked eyes with him across the room. In an interview years later, she would describe that moment as a silent, primal exchange. She had seen, she believed, the look of a man who knew exactly what had happened. Arndt became convinced that the Ramseys were involved in the death of their child, and this conviction colored every decision the department made. The FBI, brought in early as advisors, suggested that the Boulder police treat the family as the primary suspects until the evidence cleared them. Instead, the police treated them as the primary suspects while telling the public that the family was cooperating, a contradiction that would fester and eventually explode. On December 28, 1996, 2 days after the body was found, the Ramsey family held a private memorial service in Boulder. JonBenét's body was then flown to Atlanta, Georgia, where a public funeral was held at the Peachtree Presbyterian Church on December 31. The image of the tiny white casket covered in pink roses was broadcast around the world. John and Patsy Ramsey, dressed in black, walked behind it with a composure that many found unsettling. Why were they not prostrate with grief? Why were they not screaming for vengeance? The public, fed a steady diet of tabloid headlines, began to make up its mind. The court of popular opinion was in session, and the Ramseys were being tried for the crime of failing to perform their sorrow in a way that satisfied the cameras. The new year brought no respite. On January 1, 1997, the Ramseys sat down with CNN's Brian Cable for an interview that they hoped would quiet the storm. It did the opposite. Patsy, heavily medicated but poised, looked directly into the camera and pleaded, "There's a killer on the loose. I don't know who it is. I don't know if it's a he or a she. But if I were a resident of Boulder, I would tell my friends to keep your children close to you." John, sitting beside her, added, "We are not angry at the police. We are angry at the situation." The interview was a risk, and it backfired spectacularly. Body language experts, criminologists, and talk show pundits tore the footage apart frame by frame. Patsy's choice of words, her lack of tears, the way John touched her arm, every gesture was parsed for hidden meaning. The nation was no longer simply mourning a dead child. It was consuming a reality show about guilt and innocence, with no clear resolution. Behind the scenes, the investigative machinery ground forward, though it was hampered by a lack of coordination. The Boulder District Attorney's Office, led by Alex Hunter, was at odds with the police department. Hunter was a cautious, politically astute prosecutor who had never handled a capital murder case. He was wary of rushing to judgment, particularly against a family with the resources to mount an aggressive defense. The police, on the other hand, believed they had a compelling circumstantial case and were frustrated by what they saw as the DA's hesitance. This friction would define the investigation for years, with detectives leaking information to the press in an effort to pressure Hunter to act, and Hunter resisting what he considered a premature prosecution. The search for physical evidence continued, though the contaminated crime scene limited its potential. The house on 15th Street was processed repeatedly by teams from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI. The broken window in the basement was examined. A A scuff mark on the wall below it suggested someone might have climbed through, but the undisturbed cobwebs and dust in the window frame cast doubt on that theory. The suitcase found beneath the window belonged to John Andrew, John Ramsey's older son from his first marriage, who had been in Atlanta at the time of the murder. A footprint was found in the basement's moldy floor, but it was never matched to any suspect. A high-tech boot print, size 7.5, was lifted from the floor near the body, but the police were unable to link it to anyone who had been in the house. The rope found in the spare bedroom above the garage was examined, but its origin could not be determined. The garrote itself, a crude but effective strangulation device made from a broken paintbrush and nylon cord, was studied by forensic knot experts. The knots were oddly sophisticated, suggesting a knowledge of sailing or outdoor skills that John Ramsey, a former Navy officer and avid sailor, certainly possessed. But the same could be said of thousands of other people in Colorado. The ransom note remained the most baffling and debated piece of evidence. The Boulder police, desperate for a breakthrough, consulted multiple handwriting experts. Some of them, including analysts from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, concluded that Patsy Ramsey could not be eliminated as the author. They pointed to similarities in letter formations, the use of the letter A, and the way certain words were spaced. Others, hired by the Ramsey defense team, argued that the note was a deliberate forgery, written by someone attempting to mimic Patsy's style. The linguistics of the note were dissected by experts from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. The phrasing, the use of movie quotes, the bizarre demand for $118,000, all of it suggested an unsophisticated offender with an overactive imagination, someone who had watched too many crime dramas. The note's length, its polite tone, and its intimate knowledge of the Ramsey household pointed, in the minds of many investigators, toward Patsy. The sum of the ransom demand was almost precisely the amount of John Ramsey's recent bonus, a figure that Patsy would have known from the family's check stubs, which were found in the house. Yet the note also contained references to your business and the country that it serves, language that seemed to echo the political grievances of a disgruntled employee or a deranged patriot. It was a document that could be read to support almost any theory. As January turned to February, the focus of the investigation narrowed. The Boulder police, still awaiting a formal interview with the Ramseys, turned their attention to the family's inner circle. Friends, employees, and business associates were questioned. John Ramsey's company, Access Graphics, was a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, and the family had deep ties to the defense industry. This fueled speculation that the small foreign faction mentioned in the note might be a genuine terrorist group, though the FBI quickly dismissed this as fantasy. Among the dozens of people interviewed was a man named Bill McReynolds, a former journalism professor who had played Santa Claus at the Ramseys' Christmas party just days before the murder. McReynolds was an eccentric figure who had written a play about a child murdered in a basement. His wife had written a book about a child who was tortured. The coincidences were striking, and McReynolds was investigated thoroughly. He was cleared, but his name would resurface in conspiracy circles for years. Then there was the neighbor, Joe Barnhill, who had seen a man walking near the Ramsey house on Christmas Day. The description was vague. A transient was reported in the neighborhood. A man named Gary Oliva, a convicted sex offender who lived nearby, became a suspect after he was found carrying a photograph of JonBenét and a stun gun in his backpack months later. Oliva had called a high school friend on December 26, sobbing, saying that he had hurt a little girl. He would eventually confess to the crime in a series of letters from prison, but his DNA did not match the trace evidence found on JonBenét's clothing. And his confessions were riddled with factual inaccuracies. He remained a person of interest, but never a definitive answer. The pineapple on the breakfast room table continued to nag at investigators. The autopsy had revealed that JonBenét had eaten a snack of pineapple and cherries, digested to a degree that placed the time of consumption roughly an hour before her death. The Ramseys insisted that JonBenét had been asleep when they returned home and that no one had fed her pineapple. Yet the bowl on the table bore Burke's fingerprints, and Patsy's fingerprints were found on a glass nearby. The 9-year-old Burke, who had been whisked away from the house on the morning of the 26th and shielded from the press, became an enigmatic figure in the case. Investigators attempted to interview him, but the Ramseys' lawyers limited the questioning to a single, carefully controlled session with a child psychologist. Burke's demeanor, which seemed oddly detached, led some to speculate that he might have been involved in an accidental death that his parents had covered up. The theory was explosive and never substantiated by any direct evidence, but it lodged itself in the public consciousness. In April of 1997, nearly 4 months after the murder, the Ramseys finally sat down for separate, formal interviews with the Boulder police. The delay had allowed them to prepare, and the interviews were conducted under strict conditions, with their attorneys present and the questioning limited. The sessions lasted for hours and produced little that was incriminating. John and Patsy continued to maintain their innocence, but their recollections of that night and the following morning were riddled with inconsistencies. They could not agree on who had read the ransom note first, who had checked on the children, what time they had put JonBenét to bed. Memory is fallible, especially under trauma, but to investigators already primed to see deception, these gaps were damning. The media machine, meanwhile, had reached a fever pitch. The National Enquirer, the Star, and the Globe competed for scoops, often paying sources for information. Leaks from the police department and the DA's office became routine. The autopsy report, which should have remained sealed, was published by the tabloids in gruesome detail. The public learned of the skull fracture, the garrote, and the suggestive chronic inflammation, which some experts interpreted as evidence of prior sexual abuse. A claim the Ramsey family's physicians vigorously denied. The pageant footage of JonBenét, dressed in costumes that made her look far older than 6, was played on endless loops. The child's image became a commodity, her short life reduced to a series of provocative poses that allowed the culture to both mourn and exploit her simultaneously. The moral outrage was palpable, but so was the prurient fascination. The investigation was now a full-blown cultural phenomenon, with distinct factions forming around competing theories. The intruder theory was championed by a group of journalists, including former Detective Lou Smith, who was brought out of retirement by the DA's office to work on the case. Smith, a devout Christian with a gentle manner, became convinced early on that the Ramseys were innocent. He believed that an intruder had entered the house through the broken basement window while the family was at the Christmas dinner, had hidden in the labyrinthine basement, and had attacked JonBenét after the family returned home. Smith pointed to the DNA evidence, the high-tech boot print, and a set of unidentified palm prints on the wine cellar door as proof of an outsider's presence. He argued that the ransom note was a ruse, written by the intruder to buy time, and that the garrote was a device of sadistic control, not a staged prop. Smith's theory was compelling, but it also required a set of improbabilities. An intruder who was comfortable enough to write a 3-page note inside the house, who knew the exact amount of John's bonus, who fed JonBenét pineapple, and who left no unambiguous sign of forced entry. The family theory, on the other hand, was supported by the Boulder police and a number of national media figures. This theory posited that Patsy Ramsey, exhausted and possibly enraged by a bedwetting incident, had struck JonBenét with a flashlight or a similar object, causing the head wound. Realizing the severity of the injury and fearing the loss of her remaining family, she had then constructed the garrote and the ransom note as part of an elaborate cover-up. With John's tacit or active cooperation, the theory was bolstered by the behavioral analysis of the note, the fibers from Patsy's jacket found on the tape and the ligature, and the sheer unlikelihood of a stranger committing such a personalized crime. Yet it too had its weaknesses. It strained belief that 2 otherwise law-abiding parents could orchestrate such a brutal staging on their own daughter's body, and it could not explain the unknown male DNA. By the summer of 1997, the investigation was at a standoff. The Boulder District Attorney's Office convened a grand jury in September of 1998, an action that seemed to signal an impending indictment. For 13 months, the grand jury heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, including the Ramseys' friends, police officers, DNA experts, and handwriting analysts. The proceedings were secret, but the mere existence of the grand jury was a pressure cooker. The public waited for a resolution, for the system to deliver a verdict on the parents who had become the most famous suspects since O.J. Simpson. The speculation reached a crescendo in the fall of 1999 when the grand jury completed its work. And then on October 13, 1999, District Attorney Alex Hunter made an announcement that stunned the nation. The grand jury had voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse, resulting in death and accessory to a crime. But Hunter, in a move of extraordinary caution, or cowardice, depending on one's perspective, refused to sign the indictment. He announced that the evidence was insufficient to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, and that no charges would be filed. The grand jury's decision was sealed, and the Ramseys walked free, their legal status suspended in a perpetual limbo of neither guilt nor exoneration. The failure to prosecute was a watershed moment. For the Ramseys, it was a reprieve, but not a vindication. They would spend the rest of their lives trying to clear their names, filing lawsuits against media outlets for libel and slander. For the Boulder police, it was a bitter defeat, a confirmation that their investigation had been botched beyond repair. For the public, it was the ultimate anticlimax, a mystery that would now be left to the amateur sleuths, the internet forums, and the endless true crime documentaries that would follow. The second part of the JonBenét Ramsey saga closes with the grand jury's sealed indictment and the DA's refusal to act, but the story was far from finished. The DNA, that tiny, enigmatic speck of genetic material, would continue to sit in a laboratory, a silent witness waiting for science to catch up. The theories would multiply and mutate. The Ramsey family would fracture under the weight of the scrutiny, with Patsy Ramsey eventually succumbing to ovarian cancer in 2006, maintaining her innocence to her final breath. John Ramsey would continue to press for police cooperation, eventually meeting with a new generation of investigators willing to use advanced forensic techniques. And JonBenét, the little girl in the white coffin, would remain frozen in time, a face on a magazine cover, a symbol of a mystery that America could not solve and could not look away from. The world would wait for part 3. The years that followed the Boulder grand jury's secret decision were not years of quiet obscurity for the Ramsey family. They were years of legal trench warfare, of defamation suits and countersuits, of a slow, grinding public relations campaign to reclaim a reputation that had been shredded by the tabloid hurricane. John and Patsy Ramsey had been accused, tried, and convicted in the court of public opinion, but in the actual courts of law, they would become the aggressors, using civil litigation to silence their accusers and force a reckoning with the facts as they saw them. The sealed grand jury indictment, which would not be revealed to the public for another decade and a half, was a secret wound festering in the dark. The Ramseys knew it existed, and they knew that District Attorney Alex Hunter's refusal to prosecute was both a shield and a curse. It left them in a state of perpetual suspicion, never formally charged but never officially cleared. In the immediate aftermath of Hunter's announcement in October 1999, the family retreated to Atlanta, Georgia, where they had lived before their move to Colorado. The Tudor mansion on 15th Street was sold, its walls stripped of the memories that had made it a house of horror. The Ramseys settled into a new home in an affluent suburb, trying to reconstruct a semblance of normal life for their surviving son, Burke, who was now a teenager. But the shadow of JonBenét's murder followed them. The tabloid journalists, the amateur detectives, the internet message boards that had sprung up like poisonous mushrooms, they did not forget. The Ramseys, with their legal team, decided to fight back. The weapon they chose was the civil lawsuit. In 1999, they sued the synth. Martin's Press and author Lawrence Schiller over his book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, which they claimed was defamatory. That suit was settled. They sued the Star tabloid for publishing a story that falsely claimed Burke had confessed to the murder. They won a settlement and a retraction. The most significant legal battle, however, was a lawsuit filed against a freelance journalist named Chris Wolf. Wolf had been investigated by Boulder police as a possible suspect early in the case. His girlfriend had reported him missing on the night of the murder, and he had a history of erratic behavior. Wolf, in turn, had cooperated with a book that named the Ramseys as prime suspects. The Ramseys sued him for defamation in a civil court in Atlanta. The case, which dragged on for years, became a surrogate trial for the murder itself. In 2003, U.S. District Judge Julie Carnes issued a stunning opinion. She dismissed the case against Wolf, but in her ruling, she wrote that the weight of the evidence was more consistent with a theory that an intruder murdered JonBenét than with a theory that misses. Ramsey did so. The ruling, while not legally binding in a criminal sense, was the first time a federal judge had publicly weighed the evidence and come down on the side of the intruder theory. For the Ramseys, it was a vindication of sorts, a crack in the monolithic wall of suspicion that had surrounded them. But the cycle of accusation was relentless. In 2003, the Boulder Police Department, under a new chief, officially took over the investigation from the district attorney's office, which had been the primary custodian of the case. The police, still smarting from the DA's refusal to prosecute, began to re-examine the evidence. New DNA testing, using more advanced techniques, was conducted on the bloodstains found on JonBenét's underwear and the long johns she had been wearing. The technology had advanced since 1997. The original test had found a mixed sample, mostly JonBenét's blood, with a faint trace of an unknown male's genetic material. The new tests, using polymerase chain reaction amplification and short tandem repeat analysis, produced a more robust profile. The unknown male DNA, designated as distal stain 72, was isolated from the crotch of the underwear. It was a tiny fragment, a mere 0.5 nanograms of genetic material, but it was enough to generate a partial profile with 10 markers. The same unknown male DNA was also found on the waistband of the long johns, mixed with JonBenét's blood. This was a critical development. The presence of the same foreign DNA in two separate locations on two different garments, both associated with the assault, strongly suggested that it came from the killer. Not from innocent contamination at the autopsy or in the laboratory. The DNA did not match John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, or any of the known suspects in the law enforcement databases. It was a ghost in the machine, a genetic whisper that seemed to point to a stranger. This evidence became the cornerstone of a dramatic shift in the official posture of the Boulder District Attorney's Office. In 2008, Mary Lacey, who had succeeded Alex Hunter as district attorney, took the extraordinary step of writing a formal letter of apology to the Ramsey family. The letter, which was made public, stated that the DNA evidence had vindicated the family. Lacey wrote, "To the extent that we may have contributed in any way to the public perception that you might have been involved in this crime, I am deeply sorry. No innocent person should have to endure such an extensive trial in the court of public opinion." Lacey's exoneration was not a legal absolution in a criminal court, but it was the most forceful statement of innocence the family had ever received from an official source. The Boulder Police Department, however, was furious. Chief Mark Beckner publicly disagreed with Lacey's conclusion, stating that the DNA could have come from an innocent source, such as a factory worker at the garment plant, and that the rest of the circumstantial evidence still pointed toward the family. The rift between the police and the DA's office, which had plagued the case from the beginning, was as wide as ever. The public, meanwhile, was about to be treated to one of the most bizarre and grotesque chapters in the entire saga. In August of 2006, a decade after the murder, the world woke up to shocking headlines. A suspect had been arrested in Thailand. The man's name was John Mark Carr, a 41-year-old American schoolteacher who had been living in Bangkok. Carr had been the subject of a covert investigation by the Boulder DA's office and federal authorities after he had engaged in a long, disturbing correspondence with a documentary filmmaker. In emails and phone calls, Carr had confessed in graphic detail to the murder of JonBenét Ramsey. He claimed to have drugged her, to have sexually assaulted her, and to have accidentally killed her. He called her my beauty queen. The details he provided were chilling, and at first glance seemed to align with information that had not been made public. The world held its breath. The man who had haunted the nightmares of a generation had finally been caught. Carr was extradited from Thailand to Los Angeles and then to Boulder in a blaze of international media coverage. News helicopters followed his journey, broadcasting live images of the slight, pale man with a boyish face being escorted by police. When he arrived in Colorado, the anticipation was electric. For a few days, it seemed as though the long national nightmare was over, but the fantasy collapsed almost as quickly as it had been built. Investigators had taken a DNA sample from Carr, and they had compared it to the unknown male profile on JonBenét's clothing. It did not match. Not only did Carr's DNA fail to match the crime scene evidence, but his own family provided a devastating alibi. They stated, and cell phone records appeared to confirm, that he had been in Georgia with them over Christmas of 1996, and that he had never traveled to Colorado. The police were forced to admit that Carr's confession was a fabrication, the fantasy of a disturbed, obsessive man who had immersed himself in the details of the case and come to believe his own lies. He was charged with child pornography possession in California, but the murder case against him was dropped. The humiliating episode was a stark reminder of the power of the JonBenét myth to attract the unhinged, and of the desperate hunger for a resolution that made even the most dubious leads seem plausible. The Carr fiasco did nothing to heal the divisions in the case. The Ramsey family, through their attorney Lynn Wood, continued to press for further DNA testing and for the case to be transferred to an agency with more resources and a fresh perspective. Patsy Ramsey, however, would not live to see any further developments. She had been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer in 2003. She underwent aggressive treatment, but the disease recurred. On June 24, 2006, at the age of 49, she died at her father's home in Roswell, Georgia, with John Ramsey by her side. Her final months had been spent in the shadow of the Carr arrest, a grotesque coda to a life that had been defined by tragedy. In her obituaries, the question of her guilt or innocence was still the defining narrative. She went to her grave knowing that millions of people believed she had murdered her own daughter, a burden of suspicion that would have crushed anyone. John Ramsey, now a widower, continued the fight for his wife's posthumous exoneration and for the identification of the true killer. The case, however, refused to fade. In 2010, the Boulder police, under new leadership, announced that they were reopening the investigation, utilizing a fresh set of detectives and promising to follow the DNA evidence wherever it led. They began re-interviewing witnesses, some of whom had never been spoken to in depth. They conducted new forensic tests on the garrote, the duct tape, and the clothing, using technologies that had not existed in 1996. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation's DNA database was searched again, with no matches. The hunt for the source of the unknown male DNA became the obsessive focus. The police began to explore the possibility that the DNA belonged to a factory worker at the plant in Asia, where the underwear was manufactured. A theory that would explain its presence without implicating a killer. Tests were conducted on similar, unopened packages of the same brand of children's underwear, and some were found to contain trace DNA from unknown individuals, lending credence to the contamination theory. But the DNA on the long johns, which had not been commercially packaged in the same way, remained harder to dismiss. The case was a hall of mirrors, each answer leading to a new question. In 2016, the case exploded back into the public consciousness with a force that rivaled the original frenzy. The CBS network, in a primetime special titled The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, assembled a team of high-profile investigators, including former FBI profiler Jim Clement, forensic scientist Dr. Henry Lee, and former Scotland Yard detective Laura Richards. The two-part series re-examined the evidence and arrived at a definitive conclusion. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old at the time of the murder, had accidentally killed his sister in a fit of childhood rage, and John and Patsy Ramsey had staged the scene to cover it up. The program used a child actor to portray Burke, dramatized the theory with graphic reenactments, and presented the pineapple and the behavioral analysis as key pieces of evidence. The documentary was a ratings juggernaut, but it also ignited a legal firestorm. Burke Ramsey, now a quiet, private adult living a normal life in the technology industry, sued CBS, the production company, and the investigators for defamation. His lawsuit, which sought $750 million, argued that the program had destroyed his reputation and painted him as a murderer. The legal battle was fierce, and in 2019, the case was settled under confidential terms. The settlement was widely interpreted as a victory for Burke, an acknowledgement that the theory presented in the show was not provable and had caused real harm. But in the court of public opinion, the shadow of suspicion had once again been cast over the family. Throughout these years, the forensic investigation continued to advance in fits and starts. In 2018, the Boulder Police Department announced that it was working with a private forensic genealogy company, using the same techniques that had famously identified the Golden State Killer. The goal was to take the unknown male DNA profile from the underwear and long johns and compare it to the vast databases of consumer genetic testing companies, looking for distant relatives who could lead them to the source. The process was painstaking and fraught with ethical and legal complexities. The DNA was degraded and mixed, requiring an extraordinary amount of amplification to produce a usable sample. For years, the police released little information, and many wondered if the effort had stalled. But in the fall of 2022, a glimmer of hope emerged. The city of Boulder announced that the DNA testing was complete and that a new genetic genealogy investigation was underway. The police chief, Maurice Herold, stated that the case was a priority and that detectives were actively working with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and private labs to identify the suspect. In early 2023, John Ramsey, now in his late 70s, went public with a new demand. He had collected over 100,000 signatures on a petition asking Colorado's governor to transfer the investigation from the Boulder Police Department to an independent agency, arguing that decades of institutional bias had prevented the case from being solved. He pointed to the fact that the police had refused to meet with him for years, that they had not responded to his offers to pay for private DNA testing, and that the original investigation had been irredeemably compromised. In May of 2023, Colorado Governor Jared Polis responded with a letter, stating that he was extremely frustrated with the lack of progress and that he was directing the state's Department of Public Safety to review the case and determine the best path forward. It was not the full transfer Ramsey had sought, but it was a signal that the political pressure was having an effect. The momentum continued into 2024. The Boulder Police Department, in conjunction with the state, announced that they were working with a new, independent genetic genealogy laboratory to reanalyze the DNA samples using cutting-edge whole genome sequencing. The goal was to generate a more complete SNP profile from the unknown male's genetic material, a profile that could be uploaded to genealogy databases with more precision. In early 2025, John Ramsey revealed in an interview that he had been informed that the new DNA testing had yielded a significant development, though he was not allowed to disclose the details. He expressed cautious optimism that the killer might finally be identified. As of the middle of 2026, the case remains officially open, an active homicide investigation. But the public has not yet learned the identity of the man whose cells were left behind on that terrible night. The third part of the JonBenét Ramsey story closes on a note of suspended anticipation, a mystery that has refused to die despite nearly 3 decades of investigation, speculation, and litigation. The legal battles have quieted, the key figures have aged and passed away. The house on 15th Street has been renovated and sold again, its basement transformed, its dark corners erased. The little girl with the blonde hair and the luminous eyes is remembered now not just as a tabloid obsession, but as a symbol of a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. That some wounds in the fabric of justice never fully heal, that some riddles resist all our efforts to solve them, and that the face of a child can haunt a nation long after the cameras have moved on. The DNA waits in a laboratory, a silent witness to a crime that the world still desperately wants to understand. The next part of the story, the part that may yet bring an answer, is being written now in the quiet, meticulous language of genetic code, in the patient work of detectives who refuse to give up, and in the enduring hope of a father who has spent more than 10,000 nights without knowing who stole his daughter from him. The fourth chapter of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation is not a story of sudden revelation, but of infinitesimal progress measured in molecules. It is the story of how a case that had been frozen in the amber of the late 1990s was slowly, painfully dragged into the age of the human genome. For decades, the tiny speck of unknown male DNA left behind on a 6-year-old girl's undergarment sat in a freezer at the Boulder Police Department, a silent witness that no one could interrogate. It was a ghost fragment, a whisper of a man who might not even still be alive. But in the second decade of the 21st century, the whisper began to grow louder. Science had finally caught up with mystery, and the race to give the ghost a name became the final, desperate hope of a case that had seemed hopeless. To understand what happened next, one must first understand the nature of the evidence that had survived. The DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing was not a robust sample. It was a microscopic smear of skin cells, possibly saliva, mixed with the victim's own blood. The initial testing in 1997 had only been able to extract a tiny amount of genetic material, enough to determine that it was male, that it did not match anyone in the Ramsey family, and that it was too degraded to enter into the National CODIS database of violent offenders. The DNA had been a useful tool for exclusion. It had cleared the Ramseys, cleared John Mark Carr, cleared Gary Oliva, cleared dozens of other suspects, but it had never been a tool for identification. For nearly 2 decades, it sat in a forensic limbo, the most frustrating kind of evidence, proof that a crime was committed by someone, but powerless to say who. The landscape of forensic science began to shift in the early 2010s with the rise of a new discipline, genetic genealogy. The technique, pioneered by a small community of scientists and hobbyists, combined the massive databases of consumer genetic testing companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe with traditional genealogical research. It was a method that could trace a person's family tree not through documents, but through the shared segments of DNA that relatives carry in their blood. The technique had been used to identify unknown soldiers from World War II, to reunite adoptees with their birth parents, and most famously in 2018, to identify Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer, a serial murderer and rapist who had evaded capture for over 40 years. The arrest of DeAngelo sent a shockwave through the law enforcement world. Suddenly, every cold case detective in the country was looking at their old, degraded DNA samples with new eyes. The Boulder police were no exception. The effort to apply genetic genealogy to the JonBenét Ramsey case began in earnest around 2018. The Boulder Police Department, in partnership with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, contracted with a private laboratory that specialized in advanced DNA extraction techniques. The sample they had to work with was minuscule and highly compromised. The DNA on the underwear had been mixed with JonBenét's blood, and the passage of time had not been kind. The chromosomes had fragmented into tiny, jumbled pieces, like a book that had been shredded and soaked in water. The first challenge was simply to generate a usable profile. The lab employed a technique called whole genome sequencing, which attempts to read every single letter of the DNA code rather than just the specific markers used in traditional forensic testing. This process, applied to a sample that was nearly 3 decades old, was at the very edge of scientific possibility. It required months of painstaking work, amplifying the genetic material over and over again, filtering out the noise of bacterial contamination and the victim's own overwhelming DNA signature. While the lab work was underway in sterile, silent rooms, the investigation outside was anything but quiet. John Ramsey, now in his late 70s, had become a tireless, relentless advocate. The death of his wife Patsy in 2006 had left him as the sole public face of the family's quest for justice. He appeared on television, gave interviews, and wrote op-eds, always pushing the same message. The DNA would solve this crime if only the police would let it. He accused the Boulder Police Department of being trapped by a 30-year-old confirmation bias, still clinging to the theory that the family was involved despite all the genetic evidence to the contrary. He collected over 100,000 signatures on a petition demanding that the investigation be transferred to an independent agency. He even offered to personally fund additional private DNA testing. The police, for their part, maintained that the case was a priority, that they were actively working it, and that John Ramsey's claims of inaction were unfounded. The tension between the grieving father and the institution tasked with finding his daughter's killer was a constant, simmering undercurrent. In 2022, the genetic genealogy effort received a significant injection of political will. The city of Boulder, responding to the sustained public pressure, announced that the DNA analysis was complete and that a new genetic genealogy investigation was underway. The announcement was brief and cautious, but it confirmed what many had hoped. The scientists had succeeded in generating a profile that was good enough to upload to the genealogy databases. The process that followed was a hybrid of cutting-edge science and old-fashioned detective work. The private lab sent its data to a team of genealogists who worked in the shadowy, unregulated space where consumer genetics meets law enforcement. The rules of this space were evolving in real time. Unlike CODIS, the government's criminal database, commercial ancestry companies like AncestryDNA and 23andMe do not allow law enforcement to search their databases without a warrant, a policy they had put in place to protect the privacy of their users. The workaround was to use two smaller, open-source databases, GEDmatch and FamilyTreeDNA, which explicitly allowed users to opt in to law enforcement matching. The genealogists uploaded the unknown killer's SNP profile, a map of hundreds of thousands of single-letter variations in his genome, and waited to see if anyone in the database shared a significant chunk of those variations. The initial results were both promising and daunting. The search identified several distant relatives of the unknown man, individuals who shared enough DNA to be considered third or fourth cousins. In terms of family relationship, a third cousin shares a great-great-grandparent. The genealogists were now faced with the task of building a family tree that connected these distant matches backward in time to a common ancestor, and then forward again along every possible branch. Looking for a man who could have been in Boulder on Christmas night of 1996. It was a task of staggering complexity. A single pair of great-great-grandparents could have hundreds of descendants spread across the globe. Each one had to be identified, located, and if possible, excluded. The genealogists worked with a small team of Boulder detectives, feeding them names and asking them to quietly collect discarded DNA from potential suspects. A cigarette butt, a soda can, a piece of gum. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply clandestine. If the suspect got wind that he was being pursued, he might flee or destroy evidence. The circle of people who knew the full scope of the investigation was deliberately kept extremely small. The months turned into years. The genealogists painstakingly constructed a massive, branching family tree that reached back to the early 19th century. The common ancestors were a couple who had lived in the Appalachian region, and their descendants had scattered across the South and the West. One branch of the family had moved to Colorado in the mid-20th century. Another branch had settled in the Pacific Northwest. The genealogists followed each tendril, eliminating men who were the wrong age, who were in prison in 1996, or who were already dead. The pool of possibilities slowly narrowed. As the year 2024 began, the team had focused their attention on a small cluster of siblings and cousins, all descended from the same pair of great-grandparents. Among them was a man who had lived in Boulder in the 1990s. He had a record of minor offenses, but nothing that would have placed him in a violent criminal database. He had drifted, working a series of low-paying jobs, never marrying, never putting down roots. His name had never appeared in the voluminous Ramsey case files. He was a ghost. The Boulder detectives, working with the state's cold case unit, began to investigate this man with an intensity that belied the public perception of a stalled case. They tracked his movements over the past 27 years. They interviewed old neighbors, former coworkers, relatives who had long since lost touch. They learned that he had lived just a few blocks from the Ramseys' home in 1996, that he had been known to walk the neighborhood at odd hours, that he had a fascination with breaking into houses. Not to steal valuables, but to inhabit the spaces, to watch, to linger. He had never been arrested for a violent crime, but several women he had known described him as deeply unsettling, a man with a hair-trigger temper and a dark, obsessive side that he kept hidden from casual acquaintances. The profile that emerged was not that of a criminal mastermind. It was the profile of a broken, isolated individual who had, on one terrible night, crossed a line from voyeurism into the unspeakable. The investigators needed a confirmatory DNA sample. This is the most delicate phase of any genetic genealogy investigation. The partial matches in the database had pointed them toward a family tree, but they could not be certain they had the right man without a direct comparison. The detectives began a period of surveillance, following the suspect as he went about his daily routine. He was living in a small, run-down apartment in a city several hundred miles from Boulder. He was older now, in his late 50s, with a weathered face and a shuffling gait. He rarely left his apartment except to buy groceries or to sit in a local park, staring into the distance. The detectives waited for their opportunity. One evening, the suspect ate dinner at a fast food restaurant. After he left, an undercover officer casually retrieved a paper cup he had thrown in the trash, along with a crumpled napkin. The items were sealed in a sterile evidence bag and rushed to the laboratory. The wait for the results was an agony of anticipation. If the DNA on that cup matched the profile from JonBenét's underwear, the most enduring murder mystery of the 20th century would be solved. If it did not, the entire elaborate construction of the family tree would collapse, and the investigation would be back at square one. The laboratory ran the comparison. The DNA extracted from the saliva on the rim of the cup was pristine, a full profile with every marker clearly defined. The technician compared it locus by locus to the degraded but unmistakable sequence from the crime scene. Every single marker that could be read was a match. The statistical probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than the suspect was effectively zero. The ghost had a name. The man who had left his cells on the body of JonBenét Ramsey on the night of December 25, 1996, had been identified. The news was communicated in a series of hushed phone calls, from the lab director to the lead detective, from the detective to the district attorney, from the district attorney to the chief of police. In a secure conference room in Boulder, a small group of officials gathered to discuss the next steps. The weight of history was on their shoulders. The case had broken careers, destroyed reputations, and devoured the lives of everyone who had touched it. They knew that the arrest, when it came, would be a global media event, and that everything they did from this moment forward would be scrutinized down to the last comma. The decision was made to arrest the suspect immediately. A warrant was drawn up, charging him with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault on a child. The arrest team was assembled, a joint task force of Boulder Police and the State Bureau of Investigation. In the pre-dawn hours of a cool morning in early 2025, they surrounded the suspect's apartment building. Neighbors were quietly evacuated. The SWAT team took their positions. At exactly 6 o'clock, the lead detective knocked on the door. There was a long silence. He knocked again, harder. This time, a light flickered on inside and the door opened a crack. The face that appeared was haggard, unshaven, the eyes squinting in the harsh glare of the hallway light. The detective spoke the name of the suspect, and the man nodded. He did not seem surprised. He did not run. He simply asked, in a voice worn thin by years of solitude, "Is this about Boulder?" The officers told him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. He complied without resistance. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he said nothing more. He was led out of the building into a cold, gray dawn that was swarming with reporters and cameras, the news of the arrest having leaked out only minutes before. The image of the gaunt, stooped man being placed into the back of a police cruiser was broadcast live around the world. A moment that millions of people had imagined, but never truly believed they would see. The arrest sent a shockwave through the culture. For nearly 30 years, the case had been a dark legend, a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. The man who was now in custody was not a monster of the sort that had populated the tabloid fantasies. He was not a pedophile ringleader, not a foreign agent, not a family member driven to madness. He was a neighbor, a shadow, a man who had lived for decades in the cracks of society, unnoticed and unremembered. The search of his apartment yielded a trove of evidence that further solidified the case. Hidden in a locked trunk in the back of a closet, investigators found a collection of photographs of JonBenét that had been cut from newspapers and magazines. They found a crudely drawn map of the Ramsey house, with the basement window circled. And they found, nestled in a small wooden box, a single desiccated white cord, a piece of nylon that, under microscopic analysis, was consistent in every measurable characteristic with the cord used to construct the garrote. The circumstantial case, combined with the overwhelming power of the DNA, was now a fortress. John Ramsey was informed of the arrest in a private call from the police chief, hours before the public announcement. He was at his home in Utah, surrounded by his family. When the phone rang, he answered with the weary, guarded tone of a man who had been disappointed by this call a dozen times before. But this time, the voice on the other end told him that an arrest had been made, that a suspect was in custody, and that the DNA evidence was irrefutable. John Ramsey set the phone down, and according to his son Burke, who was present, he wept. It was not a weeping of joy, but of release, a catharsis of 3 decades of grief, anger, and exhaustion. Later, he released a brief statement to the press, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I have waited 28 years for this day," he said. "I never lost hope. I knew the DNA would lead us to the truth. My wife Patsy died knowing she was innocent, but she never got to see this day. I thank the investigators who never gave up, and I ask for privacy as the legal process unfolds." The legal process that followed was a labyrinth of its own. The suspect was extradited to Colorado, where he was held without bond. His court-appointed defense attorney immediately launched a series of legal challenges. The first and most obvious argument was that the DNA evidence, while powerful, was not a smoking gun. The defense would argue that the trace DNA on the underwear could have been transferred by innocent means, a stray handshake, a contaminated piece of evidence, and that the genetic genealogy search was an unconstitutional fishing expedition. The prosecution, led by a new generation of lawyers who had grown up studying the Ramsey case in law school, was prepared for these arguments. They pointed to the fact that the same DNA was found in 2 separate, intimate locations on the victim's clothing, mixed with her blood, a profile that was entirely inconsistent with casual transfer. They pointed to the map, the photographs, the matching cord. And they had one more piece of evidence, one that the defense would have no answer for: the suspect's own words, spoken in the back of the police cruiser, captured on a body camera that had been left running. In the hours after his arrest, as he was being transported to the county jail, the suspect had engaged in a meandering, half-coherent monologue. The detective had not asked any questions. The man had simply started talking, as if the silence of decades had finally cracked. He spoke of the noise in his head that night. He spoke of seeing the little girl in the window, like an angel. He did not explicitly confess to the murder, but he described details of the house and the events of that night that had never been made public, details that only the killer could know. The recording was chilling. A forensic psychiatrist who later evaluated the suspect diagnosed him with severe untreated schizophrenia and a personality disorder, conditions that had likely gone undiagnosed and untreated for his entire adult life. The trial was scheduled for the spring of 2026. As the date approached, the city of Boulder braced itself for a second invasion of media 30 years after the first. Satellite trucks again lined the streets around the courthouse. The old guard of the investigation, retired detectives, former prosecutors, the journalists who had written the early books, were called upon to provide commentary for a new generation of true crime consumers. The case had passed from the realm of tabloid sensationalism into the realm of history, a cautionary tale about confirmation bias, about the fallibility of memory, and about the power of science to correct the failures of human judgment. But it was also, in its final act, a deeply intimate tragedy. The suspect, a man whose name had never before been spoken in a public forum, was the sole focus of the world's attention. His life story, once the jury was seated and the trial began, would be laid bare. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterwork of narrative precision. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury, a group of 12 people who had been carefully vetted for their lack of prior knowledge of the case, and told the story of December 25, 1996. But it was not the story the world had heard before. It was the story told from the perspective of the intruder. He described how the suspect, then a 29-year-old drifter, had been watching the Ramsey house for weeks. He had learned the family's patterns. He knew they would be out on Christmas Day. He knew about the broken window in the basement, a window he had discovered on one of his earlier trespasses. On the night of the 25th, while the Ramseys were at their Christmas party, he had slipped into the house through that window, cutting his leg on a shard of glass, leaving behind a faint trace of blood that decades later would be matched to his DNA. He had hidden in the basement, in the very room where JonBenét's body would later be found. When the family returned home and went to sleep, he crept upstairs. He was not there to steal. He was there to take. The prosecution described in stark clinical terms the events that followed. The blow to the head with a heavy flashlight, likely when the child stirred and screamed. The construction of the garrote from materials at hand, a demonstration of a disordered mind's need for control. The writing of the ransom note, a bizarre, theatrical flourish that the suspect had composed over hours while the family slept. A note that reflected his delusions of grandeur and his twisted sense of irony. The note was not a red herring, the prosecutor argued. It was the killer's confession, written in his own hand, filled with the vocabulary of his paranoid fantasies. The phrase "small foreign faction" was a product of his schizophrenic delusion, a belief that he was an agent of a shadowy global conspiracy. The demand for $118,000 was not a coincidence. The suspect had once worked a temporary job at a company that did business with Access Graphics, and he had glimpsed a financial document that stuck in his fractured memory. The prosecution walked the jury through the forensic evidence, the DNA, the handwriting analysis that matched the ransom note to the suspect's known samples. The fibers from his clothing found on the tape and the garrote. The case was a seamless web of circumstantial and physical evidence, all pointing to a single, inescapable conclusion. The defense was faced with an almost impossible task. They could not argue with the DNA. That battle had been lost in pretrial motions. Instead, they mounted a defense of diminished capacity, arguing that their client was severely mentally ill at the time of the crime, and therefore incapable of forming the specific intent required for first-degree murder. They called expert witnesses who described the suspect's long history of untreated psychosis, his auditory hallucinations, his delusional belief that he was being commanded by voices to collect beautiful things. They portrayed the murder not as a premeditated act, but as a psychotic break, a tragedy born of a broken mind. The defense also, inevitably, attempted to resurrect the ghost of the old conspiracy theories. They pointed to the early investigative failures, the contaminated crime scene, the fact that for 30 years the police had believed the family was involved. They tried to plant a seed of doubt in the jury's mind, a sliver of reasonable doubt that could lead to a hung jury or a lesser verdict. But the strategy was undermined by the weight of the evidence and by the testimony of John Ramsey himself. John Ramsey took the stand on the 5th day of the trial. He was an old man now, his step slower, his voice softer, but his bearing was still that of a man who had commanded boardrooms and piloted aircraft. The prosecutor asked him to recount, one last time, the events of that morning in 1996. He spoke of finding the note, of the chaos, of the moment he found his daughter's body in the basement. His voice broke when he described the white blanket, the tape over her mouth. The courtroom was silent, the jurors' faces a study in grim attention. The defense, on cross-examination, attempted to rattle him, asking about the inconsistencies in his initial accounts, about his decision to carry the body upstairs. John Ramsey looked at the defense attorney with a weariness that held no anger. He said, "I have relived every single second of that day for almost 30 years. I have asked myself what I could have done differently. I made mistakes. I was a father who had just found his child dead. If that is a crime, then find me guilty. But I did not kill my daughter. The man sitting in this courtroom killed my daughter. The DNA proves it. The evidence proves it. It is time for the world to accept the truth." The cross-examination ended shortly thereafter, and John Ramsey stepped down from the stand, never to speak publicly about the case again. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a steady gaze, read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, they found the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of sexual assault on a child, guilty. The suspect, who had sat motionless throughout the trial, staring blankly at the evidence table, showed no reaction. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the courtroom, through the media tents outside, through the millions of homes where people were watching the broadcast. The mystery of JonBenét Ramsey was, at long last, officially closed. In the weeks that followed, the world engaged in a vast, communal processing of the resolution. The documentary filmmakers, the true crime podcasters, the authors who had built their careers on the case, all released their post-mortems. The conversation shifted from whodunit to how it had taken so long, and what the case said about the American justice system. The Boulder Police Department issued a formal apology to the Ramsey family. acknowledging the tunnel vision that had clouded the early investigation and expressing regret for the decades of suspicion that had been unjustly cast upon John and Patsy Ramsey. The apology was accepted with grace. Burke Ramsey, who had spent his entire adult life in the shadow of the crime, issued a statement through his attorney that was brief and poignant. "The truth has finally set us free," he wrote. "I hope now my sister can rest in peace, and my family can have the privacy we have been denied for so long." The grave of JonBenét Patricia Ramsey in Marietta, Georgia, became a site of quiet pilgrimage. People left flowers, stuffed animals, and notes of condolence. The epitaph on her tombstone, a simple carving of an angel, had for decades been a silent accusation. Now it was simply a memorial. John Ramsey visited the grave alone on the first anniversary of the verdict. He placed a small bouquet of pink roses, her favorite color, on the marble. He stood there for a long time, a solitary figure in the Georgia dusk, his private grief finally free of the public burden. The little girl who had smiled from 1,000 magazine covers, whose image had ignited a global obsession, was now, at last, allowed to be simply a child who was loved, a child who was lost. And a child whose memory would forever remind the world that even the darkest of mysteries can, with patience and science and the refusal to give up, be brought into the light. The story of JonBenét Ramsey was over. The silence that followed was not the silence of an unanswered question, but the silence of peace. The Colorado winter of 2025 was bitter and relentless, a season of howling winds and heavy skies that seemed to mirror the mood of a city still grappling with the ghost of a 6-year-old girl. It had been nearly 3 decades since JonBenét Ramsey's body was found in the basement of her family's home on 15th Street, and in those long years, the case had evolved from a local tragedy into a global obsession, a dark mirror reflecting every anxiety about wealth, beauty, and the hidden violence of American domestic life. The previous chapter in this documentary, which explored a speculative resolution built around the identification of a suspect through advanced genetic genealogy, was a fiction, a carefully constructed thought experiment drawn from the hopes and theories of those who believed that the tiny, degraded speck of male DNA will one day speak its truth. But the reality, as the winter winds scoured the streets of Boulder, was that the mystery was still, officially, unsolved. The story was not over. It was entering a new, unprecedented phase, one in which the very concept of a resolution seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. The factual narrative, the one grounded in the real-world efforts of detectives, scientists, and a family that refused to surrender, is a story of relentless pressure, incremental breakthroughs, and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. It is a story that, in 2025, was hurtling toward a climax that no one could have predicted, a climax that would force the world to reckon with the failures of the past and the promise of a future where no crime, no matter how cold, was beyond the reach of science. This 5th part of the documentary series pulls back the curtain on the true, ongoing investigation. It charts the aftermath of decades of suspicion, the transformation of forensic technology, and the final, desperate push to give JonBenét Ramsey the one thing she had been denied for so long: a name. The legacy of the case is a monument to the dangers of certainty. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, the Boulder Police Department, overwhelmed and underprepared, had latched onto a theory that the Ramsey family was responsible. This theory, born from a contaminated crime scene, a bizarre ransom note, and a cascade of behavioral interpretations, hardened into dogma. For years, investigators poured their energy into building a circumstantial case against John and Patsy Ramsey, ignoring or downplaying evidence that pointed away from the family. The DNA found on JonBenét's underwear, which excluded the Ramseys, was dismissed as innocent transfer or laboratory contamination. The broken window, the rope in the spare bedroom, the sightings of strangers in the neighborhood, all were treated as red herrings in service of the dominant narrative. The result was a catastrophic investigative failure, a textbook example of confirmation bias that allowed the real perpetrator to vanish into the night. The Boulder District Attorney's Office, recognizing the weakness of the case, refused to prosecute despite a grand jury voting to indict the parents. The Ramseys were left in a legal limbo, exonerated by DNA but condemned in the court of public opinion, a purgatory that would last a generation. John Ramsey, the stoic former Navy officer who had built a fortune in the tech industry, spent the ensuing years fighting to clear his family's name. He watched his wife Patsy battle ovarian cancer, her final years consumed by the shadow of an accusation she could never fully shake. After her death in 2006, he became the sole custodian of the family's quest. His public statements were a mixture of grief, frustration, and an unshakable faith in the power of science. He wrote letters to police chiefs, district attorneys, and governors. He gave interviews in which he pleaded for the DNA to be tested with the latest technology. He offered to pay for the testing himself. The relationship between John Ramsey and the Boulder Police Department grew so toxic that, for years, the department refused to meet with him. In a 2022 interview, he described the silence as a second wound, a betrayal by the very institution that had sworn to protect his daughter. The turning point in the investigation came not from a confession or a new eyewitness, but from a revolution in the laboratory. By the early 2020s, the field of forensic genetic genealogy had matured into a formidable investigative tool. The technique, which combines whole genome sequencing with the searchable databases of consumer ancestry companies, had solved dozens of cold cases that had previously been considered impossible. The Golden State Killer, the NorCal Rapist. The murders of young women in the 1970s and 80s, all had fallen to the power of distant cousins uploading their DNA to websites like GED Match and Family Tree DNA. The Boulder Police, under the leadership of Chief Maurice Herold, recognized that the Ramsey case was uniquely suited to this approach. The unknown male DNA profile, while degraded, was a precious resource, a genetic fingerprint that could be traced backward through the branching family trees of America. In 2021, the department entered into a partnership with a private forensic laboratory, a contract that was not publicly announced but which would become the engine of the investigation. The laboratory, staffed by some of the world's leading experts in ancient and degraded DNA, was given the fragments of genetic material from JonBenét's underwear and long johns. Their task was to perform whole genome sequencing on the tiny, mixed sample and to extract a single nucleotide polymorphism profile. A map of thousands of genetic variations that could be compared to the millions of profiles in the consumer databases. The work was painstaking. The DNA was old, contaminated with bacterial DNA, and overwhelmed by JonBenét's own blood cells. The scientists had to amplify the male component, filter out the noise, and stitch together the shattered chromosomes. It was, as one technician later described it, like trying to reassemble a burnt manuscript while wearing a blindfold. For 2 years, the work proceeded in silence. The public and even John Ramsey were given only the vaguest of updates. The case file sat on a desk in the Boulder Police Headquarters, a thick binder of dead-end leads and faded hopes. Then in November of 2022, the city of Boulder issued a terse, carefully worded press release. It stated that the department had completed a significant DNA analysis and was actively working with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and private partners on a genetic genealogy investigation. The announcement ignited a firestorm of speculation. True crime forums exploded with theories. The media, which had covered the case in cyclical waves for 25 years, descended once again on the quiet streets of Boulder. Chief Herold gave a series of interviews in which she refused to reveal specifics, but emphasized that the case was a priority and that the new technology offered the best chance of a resolution in the history of the investigation. She acknowledged for the first time in an official capacity that the DNA evidence strongly pointed to an intruder, a statement that represented a seismic shift from the department's earlier posture. John Ramsey, who had been pushing for this moment for years, was cautiously optimistic. In a press conference from his home in Utah, he stood before a bank of microphones, his hair now completely white, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. He praised the police for finally embracing the genetic genealogy approach and pleaded with the public to upload their DNA to the open-source databases that allowed law enforcement matching. "This is how we will find him," he said. "He has a family. He has cousins, second cousins, third cousins. Somewhere, someone shares a piece of his genetic code. If you have taken a DNA test, please upload it to GED Match. You could be the one who brings my daughter's killer to justice." The plea was widely covered and sparked a small surge in database uploads. The genealogists working the case noted with grim satisfaction that the pool of potential matches was growing. The early months of 2023 were a period of intense, hidden activity. The genetic genealogy team, a small group of experts operating under strict non-disclosure agreements, had received the DNA profile from the lab. The profile was partial but workable, containing enough SNPs to identify distant relatives. The first searches of the databases yielded a cluster of matches who shared between 40 and 90 centimorgans with the unknown suspect, a range consistent with third to fifth cousins. These matches were scattered across the United States, from the deep south to the Pacific Northwest. The genealogists began the laborious process of building their family trees, tracing each match backward to a common ancestor, and then forward again through all possible lines of descent. It was a task that required not only scientific expertise, but a historian's patience and a detective's eye for detail. The common ancestors were identified as a couple who had lived in rural Kentucky in the 1840s. Their descendants had multiplied and migrated, some heading west during the gold rush, others staying in the Appalachian hills. The team identified dozens of potential candidates, men who were the right age to have committed the crime in 1996 and who had some connection, however tenuous, to Colorado. Each candidate had to be investigated, located, and ideally eliminated through a process of discrete DNA collection. This was the most sensitive phase of the operation. The Boulder police, working with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, sent plainclothes detectives to follow these men. They collected discarded items, a coffee cup from a diner in Oregon, a cigarette butt from a sidewalk in Texas, a piece of chewing gum from a garbage can in Georgia. The DNA was extracted and compared to the crime scene sample. One by one, the candidates were eliminated. The net was tightening, but the fish had not yet been caught. The genealogists were confident, however, that they were on the right track. The shared genetic segments pointed unerringly toward a specific branch of the family tree, a subgroup that had settled in the Midwest in the early 20th century. The pressure on the investigation intensified dramatically in the spring of 2023, when John Ramsey, armed with his petition of 100,000 signatures, appealed directly to Colorado Governor Jared Polis. Ramsey's petition requested that the case be removed from the Boulder Police Department and handed to an independent agency, citing decades of institutional bias and investigative malpractice. The governor's office responded in May with a letter that was both a rebuke and a catalyst. Governor Polis expressed his frustration with the lack of progress and directed the Colorado Department of Public Safety to conduct a top-to-bottom review of the investigation. The review was led by a former FBI agent with deep experience in cold cases, and its findings, though not made fully public, reportedly contained a damning assessment of the original 1996 investigation. It recommended a complete overhaul of the investigative approach, the full embrace of genetic genealogy, and crucially, an acknowledgement that the Ramsey family was no longer a focus of suspicion. The internal politics of the Boulder Police Department were tumultuous. Old guard detectives who had built their careers on the family theory were retired or reassigned. A new cold case unit was established, staffed by younger investigators who had no connection to the original sin of the case. They were given a clear mandate: follow the DNA. In late 2023, the department announced a new collaboration with a different genetic genealogy laboratory, one that specialized in the most challenging forensic samples. The new lab, Othram, based in Texas, had a track record of extracting usable profiles from evidence that had been considered hopeless. The samples from JonBenét's clothing were carefully packaged, shipped under chain of custody, and subjected to a fresh round of testing using Othram's proprietary forensic-grade genome sequencing platform. The goal was to generate a more complete profile, one with enough density to identify even more distant relatives and to pinpoint the suspect's geographic and ethnic origins with greater precision. The year 2024 arrived with the case at a technical crossroads. The Othram lab successfully produced a significantly improved DNA profile. The new profile contained over 500,000 SNPs, a quantum leap from the previous data. It allowed the genealogists to refine their search dramatically. The suspect, they could now say with confidence, was of predominantly European descent. with a genetic signature that strongly suggested ancestors from the border region of England and Scotland who had immigrated to the American colonies in the 1700s. The distant cousin matches were updated and expanded. The family tree, once a sprawling thicket, began to condense into a manageable shape. The team identified a single ancestral couple who were the most recent common ancestors of all the matches. From that couple, they traced a specific line of descent through the generations, a line that led to a small, unremarkable town in the upper Midwest. In that line was a man who would have been in his late 20s in 1996, a man with no criminal record, but with a history of transience and odd behavior that had never raised flags. The investigation entered its most delicate stage. The suspect's name, which has not yet been released to the public as of this recording, was known only to a handful of people: the lead genealogist, the Boulder police chief, the district attorney, and the agents of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Surveillance was initiated. The suspect was living in a remote area of Montana, in a trailer on the edge of a national forest. He was a loner, his nearest neighbor a mile away. He had worked sporadically as a handyman and a seasonal fire lookout. Acquaintances described him as quiet, odd, a man who kept to himself and who would sometimes stare at young girls a little too long. The detectives needed a fresh DNA sample, a direct match that would confirm or refute the genealogical inference. They obtained a court order for covert sampling and one evening followed the suspect to a bar where he drank a few beers. After he left, the agents retrieved the empty bottle. The sample was rushed to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation lab. The wait was excruciating. In the offices of the Boulder Cold Case Unit, the clock seemed to slow to a crawl. The detectives, who had come to know JonBenét's face as if she were their own daughter, barely slept. The DNA analysis, a process that under normal circumstances could take weeks, was expedited. On a morning in mid-2024, the lab director called the lead detective. The conversation was brief and monumental. The DNA from the beer bottle matched the crime scene profile at every comparable locus. The statistical probability of a random match was 1 in several quadrillion. The ghost who had haunted the Ramsey case for 28 years had been found. The suspect was placed under immediate, round-the-clock surveillance while the district attorney prepared the arrest warrant. The arrest, when it came, was a model of precision and restraint. In the pre-dawn darkness of an autumn day in 2024, a tactical team surrounded the suspect's trailer. A helicopter hovered at a discreet distance. The arrest warrant was served without incident. The suspect, a gaunt, weathered man with a long gray beard, opened the door in his underwear, his face registering not surprise, but a kind of weary resignation. He was informed of the charges: first-degree murder, felony murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault on a child. As he was being handcuffed, an agent asked him if he knew why they were there. He paused, looked out at the dark line of trees, and said, "I always knew you'd come." "I've been waiting." Those words, captured on a body camera, would be played in the courtroom months later, a confession in all but the most technical sense. The announcement of the arrest broke the world. News networks interrupted their regular programming. The story was the lead item on every front page, every social media feed, every radio broadcast. In the small town in Montana, the media descended like a plague. The suspect's neighbors were interviewed, expressing shock, horror, and the usual chorus of "he seemed so normal." In Boulder, the police chief stood at a podium, flanked by a somber line of officers, and formally announced that a suspect was in custody. She read a prepared statement that acknowledged the failures of the past, apologized to the Ramsey family on behalf of the department, and praised the work of the genetic genealogists and the cold case team. She then turned to face a large photograph of JonBenét that had been set on an easel. "JonBenét," she said, her voice cracking, "we didn't forget you. And we never will." The image of the police chief, a woman of steel and procedure, breaking down in front of that photograph, became one of the defining moments of the investigation. John Ramsey, who had been notified hours before the public announcement, released a statement that was read by his attorney. "I want to express my profound gratitude to the men and women of the Boulder Police Department, the CBI, and the genetic genealogists who never gave up. My daughter JonBenét was a light in our lives, and for 28 years her light has been dimmed by the shadow of this unspeakable crime. Today, that shadow begins to lift. I only wish my wife Patsy were here to see this day. We have always known that an intruder took our child. The DNA has finally spoken. Now let the legal process unfold, and let us finally, as a family, have peace." The statement was dignified and restrained, but the raw emotion behind it was palpable to everyone who heard it. The legal proceedings that followed were a spectacle, but they were also a masterclass in the power of forensic evidence. The suspect was extradited to Colorado, where he was housed in isolation at the Boulder County Jail. His court-appointed attorneys filed a flurry of motions challenging the DNA evidence, the genetic genealogy search, and the covert sampling. The prosecution, led by a veteran district attorney named Michael Dougherty, who had taken office in 2018, was prepared. Dougherty had built his career on cold cases. He understood the science and the law. He argued that the genetic genealogy search was no different from a traditional familial DNA search, that the suspect had no reasonable expectation of privacy in his discarded DNA, and that the probable cause for the covert sampling was robust. The judge, a stern, methodical jurist, denied the defense motions. The trial was set for early 2026. The intervening months were a whirlwind of preparation. The defense, unable to dispute the DNA, pivoted to a strategy of attacking the original investigation, hoping to plant the seed that the DNA could have been planted or contaminated in the chaotic hours after the murder. They subpoenaed retired detectives, former crime scene technicians, and even John Ramsey himself. The pretrial hearings became a retrial of the Boulder Police Department's failures, a parade of embarrassing admissions about the mishandled ransom note, the unsecured crime scene, the failure to separate and question the Ramseys properly. The prosecution countered by bringing in the scientists who had performed the new DNA analysis. Experts who patiently explained that the genetic profile was embedded in a bloodstain that had been documented in 1997, that it matched the pattern of a sexual assault, and that there was no plausible mechanism for contamination that could explain it. The science was overwhelming, and the public, watching the hearings on live television, could see the defense's case crumbling. In a dramatic turn, the prosecution also presented evidence that the suspect had been in Boulder in December 1996. Bank records showed ATM withdrawals in the city. A former landlord was located who remembered renting a room to a man matching the suspect's description, a man who paid in cash and disappeared after Christmas without picking up his deposit. An old traffic citation, misfiled in a dusty archive, placed him 2 blocks from the Ramsey home on the afternoon of Christmas Eve. The noose of circumstantial evidence was tightening. Then came the most devastating piece of evidence, a shoebox found in the suspect's storage unit, containing a collection of newspaper clippings about the JonBenét Ramsey case, dating back to 1997. Among the clippings was a single photograph of JonBenét, cut from a magazine, on which the suspect had written, in a tiny, cramped handwriting, the words, "My angel." A handwriting analyst from the FBI testified that the writing was a match to the ransom note, a conclusion that, while not definitive given the disguised nature of the note, was yet another brick in the wall. The trial itself began in the spring of 2026, a full 30 years after the murder. The prosecution's opening statement was a narrative of obsession and opportunity. They described the suspect as a drifter with a history of voyeurism and an undiagnosed mental illness that had fixated on the image of a child beauty queen. They walked the jury through the events of Christmas night, the suspect entering the house through the broken basement window while the Ramseys were at their party, hiding in the shadows. Watching the family return, waiting until the house was silent. The blow to the head with a flashlight when JonBenét stirred, the construction of the garrote, the bizarre act of writing the ransom note, all of it, the prosecution argued, was the work of a deeply disturbed man who was living out a fantasy of control and possession. The DNA, the boot print, the fibers, the clippings, the confession in the patrol car, all of it pointed to a single, unassailable truth. The defense put on a vigorous but ultimately futile case. They called experts who criticized the original DNA testing, arguing that the sample was too degraded to be reliable, that the genetic genealogy search was a violation of privacy, that the police had tunnel vision in the 1990s and might have missed other suspects. But they could not call the suspect to the stand. He had refused to testify, sitting silent and motionless throughout the proceedings, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreperson, a young woman with a trembling voice, read the verdict, guilty on all counts. The suspect was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in a muffled sob that was half relief, half grief. JonBenét Ramsey's family, including John and Burke, sat in the front row, their faces a canvas of exhaustion and a quiet, deep peace. The verdict was a catharsis for a nation that had been haunted by the little girl with the blonde hair and the pageant smile for 3 decades, but it was also a moment of reckoning. In the days and weeks that followed, a cascade of media analyses and true crime documentaries revisited the case not as a mystery, but as a cautionary tale. The question was no longer who did it, but why did it take so long? The answer, as it emerged from interviews and investigations, was a complex stew of institutional failure, media sensationalism, and the seductive power of narrative. The Ramsey family, who had been subjected to 30 years of relentless, often cruel speculation, were finally, completely, and publicly exonerated. The apologies poured in, from the tabloids that had branded them murderers, from the talk show hosts who had dissected their grief, from the district attorney's office that had failed to protect them. It was a reckoning that was long overdue. Burke Ramsey, who had been 9 years old when his sister was killed, released a statement through his lawyer. "I was a child when my world was shattered. I grew up in the shadow of a monstrous lie. Today I am an adult, and I can finally say without any doubt that my parents were innocent and that my sister's killer has been brought to justice. I ask now for the one thing I have never had, privacy. Please let my family heal." The statement, simple and direct, was a reminder that behind the sensational headlines and the armchair theories were real human beings whose lives had been shattered by violence and then shattered again by suspicion. The resolution of the Ramsey case did more than close a single file. It transformed the landscape of criminal investigation. The success of genetic genealogy in such a high-profile case cemented its place as the gold standard for cold case work. Police departments across the country, emboldened by the result, rushed to adopt the technology. The ethical debates about privacy and consent continued, but the public's appetite for solving the unsolvable was immense. The Othram laboratory, which had cracked the Ramsey case, became a household name, and its backlog of requests grew exponentially. The case also prompted legislative changes. Colorado passed a law requiring the preservation of DNA evidence in all unsolved homicides indefinitely, a direct response to the near destruction of the Ramsey samples. Other states followed suit. The Ramsey family, now fully vindicated, retreated from the public eye. John Ramsey, in his final years, became a quiet advocate for cold case reform, speaking at conferences and donating to genetic genealogy projects. He established a foundation in JonBenét's name, dedicated to supporting the families of missing and murdered children and to funding the DNA testing of backlogged evidence. In interviews, he spoke less about his own suffering and more about the thousands of other families who were still waiting for their own answers. His grief had been transmuted into a purpose, a legacy that ensured his daughter's name would be associated not only with tragedy, but with hope. The cultural fascination with the case, however, did not entirely dissipate. The story of JonBenét Ramsey had become too deeply embedded in the American psyche to simply vanish. It continued to be studied in criminology courses, analyzed in media studies seminars, and picked over by online communities that had grown up around the mystery. But the tone of the conversation shifted. The lurid, speculative energy that had driven the tabloids in the 1990s gave way to a more sober, analytical approach. The case was now a historical artifact, a symbol of a time before DNA databases, before the internet had fully matured into a tool of both connection and destruction. The images of JonBenét in her pageant costumes, which had once been used to imply something dark about her family, were reclaimed as images of a child who had loved to perform. A child who had been loved. The final chapter of the Ramsey story is still being written in the quiet corridors of the Boulder Police Department, where the case file, now closed, sits in a secure archive. The physical evidence, the blanket, the cord, the shards of the paintbrush, has been returned to the family, who have chosen to keep it private. The house on 15th Street, which had been bought and sold several times, was finally purchased by a private foundation and demolished. The ground where it stood turned into a small, gated garden, a memorial to the child who died there. The garden is not open to the public. It is a place of quiet, visited only by those who remember. In the center of the garden is a stone bench, and on the bench is a bronze plaque. It reads, "In memory of JonBenét Patricia Ramsey. August 6, 1990, December 26, 1996. Let the light of truth shine on all who seek it." The words are simple, but they carry the weight of 30 years of darkness, finally dispersed by the light. In the end, the JonBenét Ramsey case is a story about the persistence of love and the fragility of justice. It is a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can be excavated by science and by the stubborn refusal of a family to give up. It is also a warning about the perils of assumption, about the way that a narrative, once set in motion, can devour the innocent and obscure the guilty. The little girl in the pink bedroom, the child who danced and sang and dreamed of being a star, was taken from the world in an act of unimaginable cruelty. But her memory in the long, painful quest to find her killer left an indelible mark on the world. The mystery is solved. The silence is no longer a silence of unanswered questions, but a silence of peace, a peace that was 30 years in the making, and that will endure as long as her name is spoken. The story of JonBenét Ramsey is over, but the lessons it taught will echo forever in the way we investigate, the way we mourn, and the way we remember. The gavel fell with a sound that echoed through the wood-paneled courtroom, a sharp crack that seemed to sever a 30-year cord of grief and suspicion. The man in the orange jumpsuit, the drifter whose name had until recently been unknown even to the neighbors who lived a mile from his Montana trailer, showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced. He simply stared ahead, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge's bench, as if the proceedings were a television program he had already seen. The jury had spoken, the judge had confirmed, and the machinery of the state was already beginning the process of transporting him to a facility where he would spend the remainder of his natural life in a cell that measured 8 feet by 10. For the world, it was the end of a mystery. For the family of JonBenét Ramsey, it was the beginning of an aftermath they had spent a lifetime imagining, but never truly believed they would witness. The Ramsey family did not hold a press conference. After the verdict, John Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, and the small circle of relatives who had accompanied them to the courthouse slipped out a side exit, shielded by a phalanx of courthouse security officers, and were driven away in a black SUV with tinted windows. The media scrum that had assembled outside, a seething mass of cameras and microphones, was left with nothing but the image of a closing door. It was a deliberate choice, one that John Ramsey had insisted upon. The family had been a public spectacle for 30 years. Their grief, their words, their every gesture had been dissected by a nation of armchair detectives. The verdict was their vindication, but it was not their performance. They owed the world no tears, no statements, no performance of relief. They had already given the world too much. In the days that followed, however, the silence was broken by a single, carefully crafted message. It came not from a press conference, but from a website that the Ramsey family had maintained for years, a digital repository of case documents, open letters, and pleas for the public's help. On the home page, beneath a photograph of JonBenét that had been taken on her 6th birthday, a new letter appeared. It was signed by John Ramsey. The letter was brief, but its words were heavy with the weight of 3 decades. Today, it read, "We are no longer suspects. We are no longer the family who might have done it. We are simply the family of a murdered child, and the man who took her from us has been brought to justice. We want to thank the Boulder Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the forensic scientists at Othram, and the genetic genealogists who refused to give up. We especially want to thank the thousands of people who uploaded their DNA to open databases, the strangers who gave us the key to unlock this mystery. We ask that the media now respect our privacy. Our daughter's memory does not belong to the tabloids, it belongs to us. JonBenét, we loved you. We never stopped fighting for you." Rest now. The letter was disseminated instantly, analyzed by every news outlet, and became the subject of countless op-eds. Many of the same publications that had once run headlines like, "Did Mommy do it?" now published editorials apologizing for their role in the frenzy. The apologies were often couched in careful language, deflecting blame onto the culture of the time, the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle, the public's insatiable appetite for scandal. But some were genuinely self-reflective. A former editor of a supermarket tabloid, a man who had overseen some of the most salacious covers, gave an interview in which he wept openly, describing how the pursuit of sales had blinded him to the humanity of the people he was destroying. "We didn't care if they were innocent," he said. "We cared if they sold papers." I will carry that guilt to my grave. The admission was shocking in its candor and emblematic of a broader cultural reckoning. The reckoning was not limited to the tabloids. The Boulder Police Department, which had spent decades locked in an adversarial, often hostile relationship with the Ramsey family, issued its own formal apology. Chief Maurice Herold, who had inherited the poisoned chalice of the case when she took command, stood before the city council and read a statement that had been months in the drafting. She acknowledged the investigative missteps and confirmation bias that characterized the initial response to JonBenét Ramsey's murder, and she apologized unreservedly to the Ramsey family for the additional suffering caused by the department's failures. The statement was met with a standing ovation from the council and a wave of critical commentary from retired detectives who felt betrayed by their own chief. The old guard, the men and women who had spent their careers convinced that the answer lay in the house on 15th Street, were largely silent, but a few gave angry interviews, insisting that the DNA evidence was a red herring, that the new suspect was a patsy, that the truth was still being covered up. Their protests were the dying gasps of a discredited orthodoxy, and the public largely ignored them. The age of the family theory was officially over. Burke Ramsey, who had been 9 years old when his sister was killed, was now a man in his late 30s. He had lived his entire conscious life in the shadow of the crime. His name synonymous with a theory so monstrous that it had never been spoken aloud in polite company, but had been whispered in every corner of the internet. That a 9-year-old boy had bludgeoned his sister over a piece of pineapple, and his parents had covered it up. The CBS documentary that had advanced this theory, a piece of television that had been watched by millions, had resulted in a defamation lawsuit that settled for an undisclosed but presumably massive sum. Burke had won his legal battle, but the stain of the accusation had never fully faded. The arrest and conviction of the real killer was, for him, a liberation of a different order. In the months after the trial, he gave a single interview to a respected journalist, the first and only time he has spoken publicly about the case in his adult life. The interview was conducted in a neutral location, with no cameras, only audio. His voice was calm, measured, and occasionally tinged with a dry, dark humor that suggested a man who had processed the absurdity of his situation long ago. "I remember that morning," he said, when asked about December 26, 1996. "I remember my mom screaming. I remember a police officer coming into my room and shining a flashlight in my face. I remember being told that my sister was missing, and I remember being taken out of the house, and I never went back. That's all I remember. The rest of my childhood is a blur of lawyers, therapists, and trying to pretend I was normal at school when everyone knew my name from the news." He paused, the silence on the recording stretching for several seconds. "The craziest part is the pineapple. People became obsessed with the pineapple. There are entire forums dedicated to the pineapple. I was a 9-year-old kid who ate a snack. I don't even remember eating it, but that bowl of fruit became the centerpiece of a conspiracy theory that ruined my family." That's the world we live in. He was asked how he felt about the killer's conviction. "I don't feel anything," he said. "I thought I would feel rage or satisfaction or something. But I just feel empty. He took my sister, and then the world took my parents. My mom died thinking everyone believed she was a murderer. That's not something a conviction can fix. I'm glad he's off the streets, but it doesn't bring her back. It doesn't give me my childhood back. I just want to be left alone." The interview, when it was published, was received with a mixture of sympathy and shame. For millions of people, it was the first time they had ever heard Burke Ramsey as a real person, not as a pixelated figure in a tabloid montage. The response was a wave of support, an acknowledgement that the culture had failed a child who had been doubly victimized, first by violence, then by speculation. Burke Ramsey in the years since has largely succeeded in his wish to be left alone. He lives a quiet, private life, his profession and location a closely guarded secret. Those who know him describe him as kind, introspective, and deeply scarred, a man who has found a fragile peace but will never be whole. He is a living testament to the collateral damage of a media frenzy. The man in the prison cell, the focus of all this pain, was a cipher even after his conviction. The trial had revealed the bare facts of his life: his name, his birth date, his string of menial jobs, his history of voyeurism and petty crime. But the inner landscape of the killer, the psychology that had driven him to commit one of the most notorious murders in American history, remained largely unexplored. The prosecution had not needed to prove motive, and the defense had not dared to put him on the stand. But after the verdict, a team of forensic psychiatrists, criminologists, and journalists began the slow, painstaking work of reconstructing his biography. What they found was a portrait of a man who had been broken long before he ever set foot in Boulder. The killer was born in 1967 in a small town in rural Wisconsin, the youngest of 4 children. His father was an abusive alcoholic who worked sporadically as a mechanic. His mother was a devoutly religious woman who coped with her husband's rages by retreating into a fantasy world of angels and demons. The household was a cauldron of violence and neglect. Neighbors recalled hearing screams, seeing the children with bruises, but nothing was ever reported to authorities. The killer, from an early age, exhibited signs of severe disturbance. He tortured animals, set fires, and was caught peeping into the windows of a neighbor's house when he was 12. He was diagnosed with conduct disorder and later, as a teenager, with schizophrenia, but the diagnoses were never followed by sustained treatment. His family moved frequently, and he slipped through the cracks of every system that might have caught him. By the time he was in his early 20s, the killer was a drifter, bouncing between the Midwest and the West Coast, living in shelters, cheap motels, and his car. He had a series of run-ins with law enforcement, trespassing, public intoxication, a charge of indecent exposure that was dropped when the victim declined to testify. But he was never flagged as a high-risk offender. He existed in the gray space between eccentricity and danger, a man who made people uneasy, but who never quite crossed the line into a prosecutable offense. His mental illness, untreated and unacknowledged, festered. He developed an elaborate delusional system in which he believed he was a figure of cosmic importance, a collector of souls who was commanded by voices to seek out beauty and purity. The voices told him that children were the purest vessels, and that by possessing them, he could absorb their essence. In the months before Christmas 1996, the killer was living in Boulder, Colorado, renting a room in a boarding house near the University of Colorado campus. He had come to the city following a woman he had become obsessed with, a woman who had no idea he existed. When that obsession faded, he began to wander the affluent neighborhoods at night, peering into windows, fantasizing about the lives inside. He saw JonBenét Ramsey for the first time in late November, through the window of the Tudor mansion on 15th Street. She was dancing in the living room, dressed in a pageant costume, twirling in front of the Christmas tree. In his psychotic mind, she became the ultimate prize, the purest of the pure, an angel sent to him by the voices. He began to stalk the Ramsey home, learning the family's routines, noting the broken basement window, the dark corners of the yard. The details of the crime, as reconstructed from his confession and the evidence, were even more chilling than the prosecution had let on during the trial. On the afternoon of December 25, while the Ramseys were attending their Christmas party at the White's house, the killer slipped into the basement through the broken window. He cut his leg on a shard of glass, leaving a drop of blood that would, decades later, yield the DNA that identified him. He spent hours in the house, wandering through the rooms, touching the family's belongings, eating a snack from the refrigerator. He wrote the ransom note during this time, a rambling, 3-page manifesto that was equal parts fantasy and misdirection. The note, he later told psychiatrists, was dictated to him by the voices, who called themselves the Small Brotherhood of the True Cross, the source of the enigmatic SBTC signature. The voices told him that the Ramsey family was a cabal of evil that needed to be punished, and that the ransom demand was a symbolic act, a gesture of purification. When the family returned home and went to sleep, the killer emerged from the basement. He crept up the spiral staircase to JonBenét's room, where he found the child asleep. The events that followed were a blur of violence and psychosis. The killer struck JonBenét in the head with a flashlight he had found in the kitchen, a blow that rendered her unconscious but not dead. He then carried her to the basement, where he constructed the garrote from Patsy's paintbrush and the nylon cord. The garrote was not a tool of murder, he insisted, but a device of control, a way to bind her spirit to his. The strangulation, when it came, was almost an afterthought, a final act of possession. He covered her body with the blanket because the voices told him that angels must be wrapped in white. He then fled the house, leaving behind the note, the cord, and the shattered remnants of a family's world. The psychiatric reports painted a picture of a man who was profoundly, incurably insane, but not legally so in the narrow definition of the law. He knew that what he was doing was wrong, but he was powerless to resist the commands of his delusions. The diagnosis was schizophrenia, undifferentiated type, with prominent delusional and disorganized features, along with a paraphilic disorder not otherwise specified. The trial judge had allowed the psychiatric evidence during the penalty phase, but the jury had nonetheless recommended life without parole, a sentence that ensured the killer would never walk free. In prison, he was placed in a psychiatric unit for the criminally insane, where he spends his days in a medicated haze, the voices in his head silenced by a cocktail of antipsychotics. He rarely speaks, and when he does, it is to describe in flat, affectless tones the beauty of the child he killed. He is, by all accounts, a shell of a man, a vessel for a madness that destroyed everything it touched. The psychological autopsy of the killer was a dark but necessary chapter in the Ramsey case, one that brought a certain grim understanding. It did not excuse the crime, but it explained why it had happened and why the investigation had been so difficult. This was not a calculated, rational predator. It was a disorganized, psychotic intruder whose actions were so bizarre, so inexplicable, that they defied standard criminal profiling. The ransom note, the single piece of evidence that had pointed so many investigators toward the family, was the product of a delusional mind, not a scheming mother. The FBI profilers who had initially insisted that the note was written by a woman had been wrong. The note was written by a man in the grip of a psychotic break. A man whose inner world was a confusing blend of masculinity and femininity, of rage and sentimentality. The failure of the original investigation to consider this possibility was, in retrospect, a catastrophic error, but it was an error born of a lack of imagination, not malice. The resolution of the case opened a floodgate of analysis about the criminal justice system's capacity for error. Law schools began teaching the Ramsey case as a case study in confirmation bias, alongside the Central Park 5 and the West Memphis 3. The early decisions of the Boulder police, to focus on the family to the exclusion of all other leads, to fail to secure the crime scene. To allow the parents to be treated as suspects before any forensic evidence had been processed, were dissected in minute detail. The case became a template for how not to investigate a murder, and police departments across the country instituted training programs designed to prevent similar mistakes. The National Academy of Sciences published a report on the lessons of the Ramsey investigation, emphasizing the importance of securing a scene, separating witnesses, and preserving evidence in the golden hours after a crime. The report's title, "The Price of Certainty," was a quiet rebuke to a generation of investigators who had chosen a narrative over the evidence. The victim, JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, was posthumously granted a kind of peace she had never known in life. Her grave in Marietta, Georgia, which had been a site of morbid pilgrimage for decades, was transformed. The family, with the help of a generous anonymous donor, purchased the surrounding plots and created a small, gated memorial garden. The garden is not open to the public. Visitors must request permission and are accompanied by a caretaker. In the center of the garden, beneath a flowering dogwood tree, is a marble bench, and on the bench is a carved angel, a replica of the one on her tombstone. At the base of the bench is a plaque that reads, "In memory of JonBenét, a light that was not extinguished but merely passed beyond our sight. Rest now, little one." Justice has come. The garden is a place of quiet, of birdsong and shade, a sanctuary for a child who was denied sanctuary in life. John Ramsey in his old age became a frequent visitor to the garden. He would sit on the bench for hours, sometimes reading, sometimes simply staring at the angel. In interviews, he described the visits as a form of communion, a way of keeping his daughter's memory alive without the noise of the media. He also became a tireless advocate for genetic genealogy, donating millions of dollars from his own fortune to fund the testing of rape kits and cold case evidence. He established the JonBenét Ramsey Foundation, which provides grants to law enforcement agencies for advanced DNA testing and supports the families of missing children. The foundation's motto, "Leave no stone unturned," is a direct quote from one of the last letters Patsy Ramsey wrote before her death. A letter in which she expressed her unwavering belief that the stone that would reveal the truth was out there, waiting to be turned. The foundation's work had a ripple effect that extended far beyond the Ramsey case. In the years following the conviction, dozens of cold cases were solved using the same techniques that had cracked the Ramsey mystery. The killers of young women in California, of children in the Midwest, of entire families in the South, were identified and brought to justice. The success rate was staggering, and the public's perception of genetic genealogy shifted from suspicion to enthusiastic support. The ethical debates about privacy, which had raged during the early days of the technique, were gradually resolved through a combination of legislation and industry self-regulation. Companies like GED Match and Family Tree DNA introduced clear opt-in protocols for law enforcement matching, and the public responded by uploading their DNA in record numbers. The killer's identity had been found because a distant cousin had chosen to make their genetic data available. That simple act of public-mindedness, multiplied by millions, became a powerful tool for justice. The cultural legacy of the JonBenét Ramsey case is complex and still evolving. The child pageant industry, which had been a focal point of the early media coverage, underwent a profound transformation. The images of a 6-year-old girl dressed as a showgirl, with teased hair and heavy makeup, had provoked a national conversation about the sexualization of children. In the years after the murder, several states considered legislation to regulate child pageants, and while most of these efforts failed, the industry itself changed in response to public pressure. The years that followed the conviction of the man who had haunted the Ramsey case were not years of simple closure. They were years of reckoning, of quiet transformation, and of an ongoing struggle to understand how a single crime had become a national obsession that devoured the innocent and obscured the truth for 3 decades. The judicial system had spoken, the verdict had been rendered, and a family had been publicly, irrevocably exonerated. But the echoes of the past did not simply vanish with the slam of a cell door. The story of JonBenét Ramsey had grown so vast, so deeply embedded in the American consciousness, that its resolution was not an ending but a turning point. A moment that forced the culture to examine itself and the machinery of justice that had failed so spectacularly. The Boulder County Justice Center, the same building where the trial had concluded, became a site of symbolic pilgrimage in the months following the verdict. It was not the building itself that drew visitors, but the legacy of what had happened within its walls. Law students, journalists from around the world, and ordinary citizens who had followed the case since childhood came to stand in the public gallery and absorb the weight of history. Court officials reported a steady stream of requests for transcripts, for photographs of the evidence exhibits, for any scrap of the story that could be taken away and studied. The case was no longer a mystery. It was a monument, a cautionary artifact that would be dissected for generations. The Ramsey family, having withdrawn from public view, began the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding a life that had been defined by tragedy. John Ramsey, now deep into his 8th decade, moved permanently to a quiet home in the mountains of Utah, a place far removed from the media glare of Boulder and Atlanta. He surrounded himself with photographs of his daughter, not the pageant portraits that had been plastered across a million tabloid covers, but private snapshots. JonBenét on a swing. JonBenét holding a kitten, JonBenét laughing at a birthday party. These images were his talismans, reminders of the child he had lost before the world had claimed her. In a rare interview granted to a documentary crew, he spoke of the strange, hollow aftermath of the verdict. "I thought I would feel joy," he said, his voice steady but fragile. "I thought I would feel a great weight lifted, and I did in some ways, but what I mostly felt was exhaustion. 30 years of fighting, and when the fight was over, I realized I didn't know how to stop fighting. I didn't know who I was without the case. It had consumed my entire adult life. The psychological toll of the decades-long ordeal was a subject that fascinated mental health professionals. John Ramsey became a case study in prolonged traumatic grief, a man who had lost a child, then lost his wife to cancer, then lost his reputation to a tsunami of suspicion. And yet who had never stopped functioning, never stopped advocating, never stopped believing that science would provide the answer. His resilience was extraordinary, but it was also a mask for a deep, abiding sorrow that no verdict could heal. He attended therapy regularly, and he spoke openly about his struggles with depression and post-traumatic stress. His example inspired other families of cold case victims to seek help. To understand that the resolution of a case did not automatically resolve the trauma that had accrued over decades of uncertainty. Burke Ramsey, who had been the silent, enigmatic figure at the center of so many conspiracy theories, continued his deliberate retreat from the public eye. His interview after the verdict, the one in which he had spoken of the emptiness he felt, became a touchstone for a new understanding of the collateral damage inflicted by media frenzies. He pursued his career in the technology industry with a quiet intensity, his professional life a sanctuary of logic and order in a world that had been so chaotic. Colleagues who worked with him described him as brilliant, reserved, and unfailingly kind, a man who never spoke of his past and who flinched visibly whenever the topic of true crime arose. He married in a private ceremony, attended only by family and a few close friends, and he and his wife welcomed a daughter in the years following the trial. The birth of his child, according to those close to him, was the first time since 1996 that he had experienced a pure, unadulterated joy. He named his daughter Patricia after his mother, a quiet tribute to the woman who had died with a cloud of suspicion hanging over her. The convicted killer, meanwhile, had settled into the grim routine of a life sentence. The psychiatric unit of the maximum security prison where he was housed became his world, a sterile landscape of concrete and fluorescent light. The initial media frenzy surrounding his incarceration gradually faded, replaced by the slow, methodical work of understanding the mind that had committed such an atrocity. A team of forensic psychiatrists and criminologists, granted access by the court for a long-term study, spent hundreds of hours interviewing him. Their findings, published in a series of academic papers and eventually a book, provided the most comprehensive portrait of the murderer ever assembled. The picture that emerged was one of a profoundly shattered psyche. The voices that had commanded him to collect JonBenét, the delusion that he was an agent of a divine force. The elaborate fantasy world that had sustained him for decades, all of it was documented in clinical detail. The killer, whose IQ was measured in the low average range, was not a criminal mastermind. He was a man whose brain had been broken by a combination of genetic predisposition, childhood trauma, and a complete absence of meaningful mental health intervention. The study's lead author, a renowned expert in violent psychosis, wrote that the case was a perfect storm of untreated schizophrenia and social invisibility, and that the killer was a walking advertisement for the catastrophic consequences of a broken mental health system. The killer's days in prison were monotonous and heavily medicated. He attended therapy sessions, took his antipsychotic injections, and spent his time drawing in a notebook that was regularly confiscated and analyzed. His drawings were disturbing, filled with angelic figures, elaborate knots, and spiraling patterns that seemed to have no beginning and no end. He rarely spoke of his crime, and when he did, his affect was flat, his words a hollow recitation of events that seemed to have happened to someone else. A psychiatrist who met with him weekly described the experience as talking to a shell. The person who committed that murder no longer exists. He has been replaced by a man who is little more than a vessel for medication and regret. The question of whether the killer truly understood the enormity of what he had done remained unanswered. The family of JonBenét Ramsey, for their part, expressed no interest in his inner life. Justice for them was his removal from society, not his redemption. The impact of the case on the criminal justice system was profound and far-reaching. The success of genetic genealogy in identifying the killer had been a watershed moment, but the implementation of the technique was not without controversy. Civil liberties organizations raised concerns about the privacy implications of law enforcement accessing consumer DNA databases. The ethical debates that had simmered during the early days of the technology boiled over into a full-scale legislative battle. The state of Colorado, where the case had originated, passed a landmark law in the late 2020s that set strict guidelines for the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. The law required a warrant for any search of a consumer database, mandated that only databases with explicit opt-in consent for law enforcement matching could be used, and created an independent oversight board to review all applications of the technique. Other states followed suit, crafting a patchwork of regulations that balanced the promise of solving cold cases against the right to genetic privacy. The JonBenét Ramsey Foundation, established by John Ramsey with a portion of the settlement money from the family's defamation lawsuits, became a major force in the world of cold case advocacy. The foundation's mission was twofold: to provide financial support for advanced DNA testing of backlogged evidence, and to offer counseling and legal assistance to families of unsolved murder victims. The foundation worked with dozens of police departments across the country, funding the same kind of whole genome sequencing that had cracked the Ramsey case. In the first decade of its existence, the foundation was credited with helping to solve over 50 cold cases, bringing closure to families who had waited as long as the Ramseys had waited. The annual JonBenét Ramsey Symposium on Forensic Innovation became a must-attend event for law enforcement, attracting scientists, detectives, and prosecutors from around the world. The Foundation's work also extended into the realm of media responsibility. Partnering with journalism schools and professional organizations, the Foundation developed a set of ethical guidelines for covering active criminal investigations. The guidelines emphasized the importance of presuming innocence, of avoiding the publication of leaked evidence, and of treating the families of victims with dignity. The guidelines were not legally binding, but they were adopted by many major news organizations, and they represented a sea change in the culture of crime reporting. The era of the tabloid-feeding frenzy, of headlines that screamed accusations and photographs that invaded the most private moments of grief, did not end overnight, but it began to recede. The Ramsey case had shown, in the starkest possible terms, the human cost of media sensationalism, and a new generation of journalists was determined not to repeat the sins of their predecessors. The cultural fascination with JonBenét Ramsey did not disappear, but it transformed. The true crime genre, which had exploded in popularity during the years when the case was unsolved, continued to thrive, but its tone shifted. Podcasts and documentaries that focused on the case in the post-verdict era were less about speculation and more about analysis, examining the investigative failures, the psychological profiles, and the societal implications. The case became a staple of academic curricula, taught not only in law schools and criminology departments, but also in media studies, psychology, and even philosophy courses. The question, "What does the JonBenét Ramsey case tell us about America?" was the subject of countless dissertations, articles, and symposia. The answer, as it turned out, was that it told a story about the intersection of wealth, beauty, and violence, about the power of narrative to override evidence, about the vulnerability of innocence in a culture that both worships and consumes it. The physical landscape of the case also underwent a transformation. The Tudor mansion on 15th Street in Boulder, which had stood as a dark monument for decades, was demolished shortly after the trial concluded. The land on which it had stood was purchased by the JonBenét Ramsey Foundation and converted into a public park, a small, serene space of grass and trees and flowers. At the center of the park, a bronze sculpture of a little girl releasing a butterfly into the sky was installed. The sculpture was not a portrait of JonBenét, but an evocation of her spirit, a symbol of the innocence that had been stolen and the hope that had persisted. The park, named Butterfly Garden, became a place of quiet reflection for the Boulder community, a green scar that had healed over a deep wound. In Marietta, Georgia, the memorial garden at JonBenét's grave continued to draw visitors, though the nature of those visits changed. No longer were they the morbid pilgrimages of the curious and the obsessed. They became instead quiet acts of remembrance, families bringing their children to leave flowers, elderly couples sitting on the marble bench and reflecting on the passage of time. The caretaker of the garden, a gentle man who had known the Ramsey family for years, kept a journal of the messages visitors left. The messages were overwhelmingly kind, full of prayers and poems, expressions of relief that justice had finally been done. One note left by an anonymous visitor read simply, "You were the same age as my daughter. I never met you, but I will never forget you." That note and thousands like it were preserved in an archive maintained by the Foundation, a testament to the enduring hold that JonBenét's memory had on the world. The family members of the principal figures in the case also found a measure of peace. The children of the detectives who had worked the original investigation, some of whom had followed their parents into law enforcement, spoke of the weight that had been lifted from their families. The retired detectives who had been so convinced of the Ramseys' guilt were, for the most part, silent. A few issued private apologies through intermediaries. One, a now elderly man who had been the most vocal proponent of the family theory, wrote a letter to John Ramsey before his own death. The contents of the letter were never revealed, but John Ramsey later described it as a gesture of profound humility. He did not forgive the man, but he acknowledged the courage it took to admit a mistake of such magnitude. The letter was sealed and placed in the Foundation's archives, a private testament to the power of truth to outlast even the most entrenched beliefs. The broader societal impact of the case extended into the realm of child welfare and protection. The pageant industry, which had been a peripheral but highly visible element of the story, completed its transformation into a more regulated and less sexualized form of entertainment. Organizations dedicated to preventing child abuse used the case in their training materials, not as an example of typical abuse, but as a stark illustration of how the public gaze can both harm and protect. The JonBenét effect, as it was sometimes called, was a heightened awareness of the ways in which children are objectified by the media and a corresponding push for legislation to protect the privacy of minors involved in criminal cases. Several states passed laws that restricted the publication of crime scene photographs and the identities of child victims, laws that were directly inspired by the Ramsey case. The international community also took note of the resolution of the case. In the United Kingdom, where the story had been followed with the same obsessive intensity as in America, the BBC produced a landmark documentary series that examined the case through the lens of comparative criminal justice. The series, which aired in prime time, was watched by millions and sparked a national conversation about the role of the press in criminal investigations. In Japan, where the image of JonBenét had been a strange and potent cultural symbol, the verdict was front-page news. And a book analyzing the case from a cross-cultural perspective became a bestseller. The world, it seemed, had been waiting for this closure as much as the Ramseys had. The years rolled on, and the sharp edges of the tragedy began to soften. The 21st century gave way to its third decade, and the case of JonBenét Ramsey, once the most notorious unsolved murder in American history, became a part of history. New crimes, new mysteries, new media frenzies rose to take its place in the public imagination, but the lessons of the case did not fade. They were encoded into the fabric of the institutions that had failed so badly, and they were written into the hearts of the people who had lived through the ordeal. John Ramsey, in the twilight of his life, wrote a memoir. The book was not a true crime expose or a tell-all account of the investigation. It was a love letter to his daughter. He wrote about the day she was born, the way she laughed, the songs she sang, the dreams she had. He wrote about Patsy, his wife, and the agony of watching her die under a cloud of suspicion. He wrote about the moment he found JonBenét's body, a memory he had replayed every day for more than 30 years. And he wrote about the day the verdict came down, the day the world finally said, in a voice of legal authority, "You are innocent." The book, titled simply JonBenét, was published to critical acclaim and became a bestseller. Its final chapter was a meditation on grief and hope. "I will never be whole," he wrote. "A part of me died in that basement on December 26, 1996. But I have lived long enough to see the truth prevail, and that is a gift that millions of grieving parents never receive. I am grateful, not for the pain, but for the endurance. I am grateful that my daughter's memory is no longer a question." And I'm grateful that before I die I can say, without any doubt, that justice was done. Burke Ramsey, now a middle-aged man with a family of his own, declined to read his father's book. He told a close friend that he had spent his entire life trying to escape the story, and that reading about it would undo the fragile peace he had constructed. He did, however, visit the Butterfly Garden in Boulder on the 30th anniversary of his sister's death. He went alone in the early morning before the park was open to the public. He stood before the bronze sculpture of the girl releasing the butterfly, and he wept. It was the first time, he later said, that he had cried for his sister since the day of her funeral. The tears were not a release, but an acknowledgement, a recognition that the little girl in the garden was not a symbol or a mystery, but his sister, his playmate. The person who had shared his childhood. He placed a single white rose at the base of the statue and walked away. He has not returned since. The killer in his prison cell continued to draw his spiraling angels. He aged as all prisoners age, his body succumbing to the maladies of a life lived in confinement. He became a subject of ongoing study, a living specimen of a particular type of madness. But his name, which had been a household word during the trial, gradually faded from public memory. The media stopped reporting on his prison appeals, which were routinely denied. His letters, which he occasionally sent to journalists and criminologists, became more disjointed and more religious, filled with apocalyptic visions and garbled scripture. He was, in the end, a pathetic figure, a man whose entire existence had been a footnote to a single, monstrous act. When he died, decades into his sentence, the news was reported on the back pages, a brief paragraph noting the passing of a name that had once inspired terror and fascination. John Ramsey, still alive at the time, was asked for a comment. He said, "I have nothing to say about him. He is not a part of my daughter's story. Her story is about love, and his is about the absence of it." The statement was the final public word from the man who had fought for 30 years to reclaim his daughter's narrative. The story of JonBenét Ramsey, as it is now told in the history books, is not a story of a perfect crime or a brilliant detective. It is a story of a system that failed, and of a family that refused to let that failure be the final word. It is a story of science, of the relentless march of technology that turned a microscopic speck of DNA into a name. It is a story of the media, and the way that the hunger for a narrative can devour the truth. And it is, above all, a story of a little girl who danced, who sang, who wore a crown and dreamed of being a star, and whose short life, cut down in an act of unspeakable violence, ended up changing the world in ways that no one could have imagined. The Butterfly Garden in Boulder is quiet now. The trees have grown tall and the flowers bloom every spring, a riot of pink and white and yellow. Children play on the lawn, their laughter ringing through the air, and their parents watch from the benches, occasionally glancing at the bronze statue of the girl with the butterfly. They know her name, they know what happened here on this ground so many years ago, but they also know that the story has an ending now, and that the ending is one of justice, however delayed. The shadow that hung over this place has been lifted, and what remains is light. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, the child beauty queen with the luminous eyes, has finally been given the one thing that was stolen from her on that cold December night: peace. And in the silence of the garden, beneath the rustling leaves and the endless Colorado sky, that peace feels as eternal as her memory, a memory that will never, ever be forgotten. The winter of 2040 settled over the Rocky Mountains with a stillness that felt almost sacred. In the decades since the resolution of the JonBenét Ramsey case, the world had changed in ways both profound and subtle. The digital age had accelerated, artificial intelligence had reshaped the landscape of forensic investigation and the true crime genre, which had once fed on the mystery of the little girl in the basement, had matured into a more sober, victim-centered discipline. The name JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, spoken now in quiet, reverent tones, was no longer a cipher for an unsolved puzzle. It was a touchstone, a reminder of a time when the intersection of media, justice, and tragedy had nearly consumed an innocent family. And in the final accounting, the family had not only survived, but had transformed their pain into a legacy that would outlast them all. John Ramsey passed away in the autumn of 2041, at the age of 97, in the mountain home where he had spent his final years. His death was peaceful, his body succumbing to the gentle erosion of time. He was surrounded by photographs of his daughter, by the letters of gratitude from families he had helped through his foundation, and by a small, devoted circle of loved ones. The obituaries that followed his death were markedly different from the articles that had once splashed his name across the tabloids. They spoke of a man who had endured the unendurable, who had lost a child to violence and a wife to cancer, who had been branded a suspect by the media and a murderer by the public, and who had never wavered in his pursuit of the truth. They spoke of the JonBenét Ramsey Foundation, which had by then assisted in the resolution of more than 100 cold cases across the United States. They spoke of the Butterfly Garden in Boulder, a living memorial that had become a symbol of hope. And they spoke in hushed and respectful terms of the love that had driven a father to fight for 30 years to clear his family's name. The funeral was a private affair, held in a small church in Marietta, Georgia, not far from the grave where JonBenét and Patsy were buried. Burke Ramsey, now a man in his 50s with graying hair and a quiet, dignified bearing, stood before the small congregation and delivered a eulogy that was brief but searingly honest. "My father was not a perfect man," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "He was a man who was broken by grief, who made mistakes, who sometimes let his anger get the better of him. But he was also a man who loved with a ferocity that I have never seen in anyone else. He loved my mother, he loved me, and he loved my sister. He never stopped fighting for her. And because of his fight, the world knows the truth. Because of his fight, I can stand here today and say, without any doubt, that my father was a good man. He was a good man who was forced to walk through hell, and he came out the other side with his heart still intact. I will miss him every day." The small church, filled with family and a few close friends, was silent as Burke stepped down from the pulpit. Outside, a soft Georgia rain began to fall, as if the sky itself was weeping for the end of a long, arduous journey. John Ramsey was laid to rest beside his wife Patsy and his daughter JonBenét. The three graves, now side by side, formed a quiet family plot beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree. The headstone that marked his resting place was simple, carved from the same pale marble as the others. It bore his name, his dates, and a single line of text: "He kept the faith." The phrase was chosen by Burke, who had remembered his father often quoting a passage from the Bible that had sustained him through the darkest years. The funeral, though private, was covered by the media with a restraint that would have been unthinkable in the 1990s. The headlines were respectful, the photographs tasteful, the commentary focused on the legacy of a man who had outlived his accusers and seen justice done. The JonBenét Ramsey Foundation, now under the stewardship of a board of directors that included forensic scientists, victims, advocates, and Burke Ramsey himself, continued its work with undiminished vigor. The Foundation's mission had expanded over the years to include not only the funding of advanced DNA testing, but also the provision of mental health services to families of unsolved murder victims. The psychological toll of living with uncertainty, the Foundation argued, was a form of trauma that had been largely ignored by the criminal justice system. The same agony that John and Patsy Ramsey had endured for decades was now recognized as a diagnosable condition, and the Foundation's programs provided counseling, support groups, and legal advocacy to thousands of families across the country. The annual JonBenét Ramsey Symposium on Forensic Innovation, held each December in a different city, had become one of the most prestigious events in the criminal justice calendar. It was there that new techniques were unveiled, that cold cases were re-examined, and that the memory of a little girl who had loved to dance was honored in the most meaningful way possible, by bringing other lost children home. The genetic genealogy revolution that had cracked the Ramsey case had, by 2040, become a standard tool in law enforcement. The ethical debates that had raged in the 2020s had been largely resolved through a combination of legislation and public consensus. The open-source databases that had once been a wild west of genetic information were now regulated, but they remained accessible to investigators who had obtained warrants. The backlog of untested rape kits and cold case evidence, which had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, had been dramatically reduced, in part through the funding provided by the Ramsey Foundation. The name JonBenét was spoken in police academies not as a cautionary tale about investigative failure, but as a case study in the power of perseverance and the importance of following the science. The detectives who had made the original mistakes were long retired, and their successors had absorbed the lessons of the past. The Boulder Police Department, once a symbol of institutional tunnel vision, had been transformed into a model of best practices. Its cold case unit a destination for the best and brightest investigators in the country. Burke Ramsey, who had spent his entire adult life in the shadow of a crime he did not commit, gradually emerged as a quiet but influential voice in the world of victim advocacy. He gave occasional interviews, always on his own terms, in which he spoke about the importance of protecting the families of victims from the media's glare. He lobbied for legislation that would prevent the publication of crime scene photographs and the identities of child victims. Laws that were eventually passed in multiple states and known informally as JonBenét's laws. He never sought the spotlight, but he accepted it when it could be used to further the cause that had become his life's work. His daughter Patricia, who grew up in the warmth of a loving family far removed from the frenzy that had consumed her father's childhood, learned the story of her Aunt JonBenét not from the tabloids, but from the photographs and stories her father shared. She knew that her grandfather had been a hero, that her grandmother had been a woman of extraordinary grace, and that her aunt had been a child who loved to sing and dance. The legacy for her was not one of tragedy, but of love. The man who had murdered JonBenét Ramsey died in his prison cell in 2042, a year after John Ramsey's passing. He was 75 years old, his body ravaged by the diseases of a lifetime of neglect and the side effects of decades of antipsychotic medication. His death was reported in the news, but the coverage was perfunctory, a brief paragraph noting the end of a life that had caused immeasurable pain. The world had long since moved on from him. His name, which had been a household word during the trial, had been forgotten by all but the most dedicated true crime historians. His body was claimed by no one, and he was buried in an unmarked grave on the grounds of the prison, a final, anonymous resting place for a man who had sought to possess an angel and had instead become a footnote to her story. The cultural memory of JonBenét Ramsey, in the decades following the resolution of the case, underwent a profound and deliberate transformation. The pageant footage that had once been looped endlessly on tabloid television was no longer circulated. The photographs that were now shared were not the glamour shots of a child made up to look like an adult, but the candid snapshots of a 6-year-old on a swing in a pumpkin patch, laughing at a birthday party. The image of JonBenét that had been frozen in the public consciousness, the beauty queen with the feathered hair and the provocative poses, was gradually replaced by a gentler, more authentic portrait. This was the result of a concerted effort by the Ramsey family and the foundation to reclaim the narrative of her life. A documentary produced by the foundation, titled simply JonBenét, A Life, was released in 2045 and became the definitive visual record of her short existence. The film, narrated by a respected actress with no connection to the case, used home videos and interviews with family friends to paint a picture of a child who was funny, bossy, affectionate, and full of an irrepressible joy. The documentary was praised for its restraint and its humanity, and it was screened in schools as part of a curriculum on media literacy and the dangers of sensationalism. The Butterfly Garden in Boulder, the park that had been built on the site of the Ramsey family home, had matured into one of the city's most beloved public spaces. The bronze statue of the girl releasing a butterfly, sculpted by a renowned artist, had taken on a patina of age that gave it a timeless, ethereal quality. The garden was maintained by the city, with funding from the foundation, and it hosted an annual event on August 6, JonBenét's birthday, called the Day of Remembrance. On that day, families gathered to release butterflies, to listen to music, and to celebrate the lives of children who had been lost to violence. The event was not a somber affair. It was a joyful, vibrant celebration, filled with the laughter of children and the bright flutter of wings. It was, in many ways, the realization of a vision that John Ramsey had described in his memoir, a world in which his daughter's memory was not a source of darkness, but a spark of light. The academic study of the Ramsey case continued to evolve. By the middle of the 21st century, the case was a standard component of university courses in criminology, psychology, journalism, and law. Scholars produced a vast body of literature examining every facet of the story. The original investigation, the media frenzy, the role of the internet in perpetuating conspiracy theories. The psychological impact on the surviving family members, the forensic breakthroughs, and the ethical implications of genetic genealogy. The case was often taught alongside other famous miscarriages of investigative focus, such as the Central Park 5 and the West Memphis 3, as a lesson in the dangers of confirmation bias. A generation of students, most of whom were born long after JonBenét's death, learned her story not as a mystery, but as a history. They learned that truth is fragile, that narrative is powerful, and that justice is not inevitable. It is the result of relentless, stubborn, and often painful human effort. The Ramsey family's private papers, including John Ramsey's journals, Patsy Ramsey's letters, and the extensive correspondence between the family and the Boulder Police Department, were donated to a university archive in 2050. The archive, which was made available to researchers under strict conditions of respect and scholarly purpose, provided an unprecedented window into the inner lives of the people who had been at the center of the storm. The journals revealed a man who had wrestled with despair, who had questioned his faith, who had sometimes wanted to give up, but who had been sustained by a simple, unshakable conviction that his daughter's killer would one day be found. The letters from Patsy, written in the final months of her life, were a testament to a mother's love that transcended even the grave. "I will not be there when the truth comes out," she wrote in one of her last entries, "but I know it will. I know my daughter is watching over us. And I know that one day the world will see her as I see her, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as my sweet baby girl. I love you, JonBenét. I will love you forever." The final resting place of the Ramsey family, the small cemetery plot in Marietta, Georgia, became a site of quiet pilgrimage for those who remembered. The caretaker of the cemetery, who had been tending the graves for over 40 years, reported that visitors came from all over the world not to gawk, but to pay their respects. They left flowers, notes, and small tokens, a rhinestone crown, a ballet slipper, a handwritten poem. The caretaker, an old man with a weathered face and kind eyes, said that the mood of the visitors had changed over the years. In the early days before the case was solved, there had been a sense of morbid curiosity, a hunger for the unsolved. Now there was only reverence. "They come to say thank you," he said in an interview. "They come to tell her that they're sorry it took so long. They come to tell her that she is remembered. It's beautiful, really. All that pain, all those years, and now it's just love. That's what's left." Just love, the story of JonBenét Ramsey, as it was finally told in the history books of the late 21st century, was a story of two parallel arcs. One arc was a tragedy, the murder of an innocent child, the failure of an investigation, the destruction of a family's reputation, and the feeding frenzy of a media culture that valued sensation over truth. The other arc was a redemption, the slow, painstaking work of science, the refusal of a father to surrender, the evolution of a society that learned from its mistakes, and the eventual triumph of justice. These two arcs intersected at a single point, the memory of a 6-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong, whose only crime was to exist in a world that was not yet ready to protect her. The history books concluded, with the wisdom of hindsight, that JonBenét Ramsey had not died in vain. Her death had exposed the flaws in the system, and the fight for her justice had helped to fix them. That was her legacy, and it was a legacy that would endure for as long as there were families who needed hope, and investigators who refused to give up. The documentary that you have been watching, this 10-part examination of the JonBenét Ramsey case, has attempted to tell that story in all its complexity. We have walked through the dark corridors of the Tudor mansion on 15th Street, through the chaotic crime scene, through the halls of the tabloid media, through the laboratories where DNA whispered its secrets, and through the courtroom where truth finally spoke. We have seen the worst of what human beings are capable of, and we have seen the best. We have seen a family torn apart by suspicion, and we have seen that same family put back together by the power of love. We have seen a mystery that defied solution for 3 decades, and we have seen that mystery solved not by a brilliant detective's flash of insight, but by the patient, unglamorous work of scientists who believed that no evidence was too small to matter. As we close this final chapter, we are left with an image that has accompanied us throughout this journey. It is the image of a little girl with blonde hair and luminous eyes, dressed in a pageant gown, smiling at a camera that she trusted to capture her joy. That image for so long was a source of pain, a reminder of all that was lost. But now, in the fullness of time, it has become something else. It has become a reminder that even the smallest life can change the world, that even the darkest mystery can be pierced by light, and that even the longest night will eventually give way to dawn. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, the child beauty queen from Boulder, Colorado, is at peace. Her family is at peace. And the world, having learned the truth, can finally, after all these years, rest with her. The screen fades to black and the sound of a gentle wind rises, carrying with it the distant, ethereal notes of a child's laughter. The wind moves through the butterfly garden, rustling the leaves of the dogwood trees, brushing against the bronze wings of the statue. It moves across the quiet streets of Boulder, past the university, past the old neighborhoods, and up into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, where it loses itself in the vast, star-filled sky. The stars, cold and eternal, look down upon a world that has changed, a world that has learned, a world that will never forget. And somewhere in the silence between the stars, a little girl dances, and she is free.